This is Luton. Welcome to my new series exploring the universe of Warhammer 40,000. 40k is a vast and fascinating universe with lore so complicated you could spend literally weeks discussing it. So one of the most difficult choices for me was where to begin with it. Now, the universe of 40k is such a mass of cross-referenced nuances and interlinked stories of revenge, justice, hatred and brutality. It's like trying to explain the whole of human history to an alien race. So breaking the lore of 40k down into YouTube videos is quite a complicated matter. Now, one last thing to mention is that Games Workshop themselves have stated that in the 41st millennium information is fragmented, intercepted, distorted, suppressed and often flat out just false. So with this in mind, a lot of 40k lore, beyond stuff that you would consider out and out facts, can be regarded more as hearsay than something that's just set in stone. This is especially true of ancient lore and race histories. This is in part because it allows Games Workshop to make changes to the universe without upsetting devout players, but it also makes a lot of sense in reality where war has been raging since almost the beginning of time. Also, if you look at humanity, it's often true that history is written by the victors, and so with that in mind you might expect some facts within the universe of 40k to be anything from an eyewitness account to complete misinformation, which then translates to becoming the gospel word as it's passed down through the ages. So where do we start our journey into the grim darkness of the 41st millennium? At the beginning, of course. We leave the Imperium of Mankind behind and travel some 60 million years before to the earliest time where one peaceful, hyper-advanced race were masters of their own destinies. These beings are simply referred to as the Old Ones, and they are, as far as recorded, the first sentient life in the universe. Their lives focused on the acquisition of knowledge and to seed the universe with life, terraforming and creating new species, including one unintelligent ape-like species on a small blue planet in the Milky Way. Now, very little specific details exist around the Old Ones themselves, but the story of their place in the grand scheme of things is where we will begin. Now, the Old Ones had great psychic powers and built many wonders of godlike beauty and size, and it was this vast understanding of the universe that allowed them to manipulate alternate dimensions and begin constructing their arguably greatest achievement, known as the Webway. Now, as its name describes, this is a web of pathways that allowed the Old Ones to travel through a vast sea of dimensional energy known as the Warp. The Warp was a dangerous and disruptive expanse of powerful psychic energy parallel to real space, although in the early times it was a lot more passive than it is in the 41st millennium, where it's extremely full of dark, horrific, chaotic energy. So to travel through it though, at this time it still required protected psychic pathways, and that's what they constructed. The Webway enabled the Old Ones to travel across unimaginable distances at incredible speed, essentially crossing space that would take millennia comparatively instantaneously, enabling them to reach the far corners of the universe. They believed that all life was useful, and they are known to have brought about the rise of numerous important species and formed thousands of worlds, which they also made their own. As the Old Ones expanded, they encountered other advanced species, although none as far as themselves, once again remembering we are at this time millennia before the dawn of mankind. One such race the Old Ones happened across were known as the Necrontyr. The Necrontyr's planet of origin was barren. It was radiation blasted due to their violent nearby star, making their home incredibly hostile to life. Their bodies were riddled with radiation sickness and they lived extremely short lives, constantly preparing for their inevitable deaths. Their cities were built in anticipation of their demise, little more than vast tomb complexes with a few temporary homes for the living. Now, they vainly tried to improve their mortality through scientific means, but after centuries they were consigned to the fact that their bodies could not be changed to survive on their home planet. Somehow though, despite this, they altered their plans to instead reach to the stars in a bid to escape their cursed cyclical fate of painful, unending death. And this is where they were to encounter the Old Ones. However, while the Old Ones were able to travel anywhere in space in mere steps and possessed near immortal length of life, the Necrontyr could not have been more opposite. They had to use slow-moving, non-warp-ready ships equipped with stasis crypts that enabled the short-lived crew to survive out amongst the stars. They clad their ships in living metal, which was a metal literally that grows and lives like that of an organic material. And this was to allow it to withstand the rigours of spaceflight. Despite this though, colonization for the Necrontyr was a slow and painful process, as was everything in their history. But upon meeting the Old Ones and seeing their secrets of near immortality sparked a hope was raised within the Necrontyr. They finally saw a chance to be saved from their pain, a chance to live. And they petitioned the Old Ones for the secret of eternal life, but were refused this knowledge. In many ways, this refusal of knowledge doomed the universe to its fate of unending war and the events that were to follow. The Necrontyr burned with the resentment and hatred of the Old Ones and their unwillingness to save them from their pain and suffering. In addition to this, the Necrontyr Empire were battling brutal civil wars known as the Wars of Secession, which the various dynasties of Necrontyr were battling one another. The encounter with the Old Ones led the Triarch, the ruling council over all the Necrontyr, believed that an external foe would unify their species, and their bitterness to the Old Ones led to war, and it worked. The prospects of vast spoils and the secret to immortality brought the Necrontyr dynasties together to launch their campaign against the Old Ones. Their hopes, however, were typically short-lived, as the Necrontyr were unable to match or outmaneuver the Old Ones, whose use of the webway enabled them to always reinforce, preempt and win battles against the Necrontyr. Eventually, conceding defeat, the Necrontyr were forced to retreat to their homeworlds, defeated and, importantly, more bitter and full of hatred for the Old Ones than ever before. At this time, the Old Ones forgot about the Necrontyr. They'd been vanquished. But the Necrontyr had no intention of dying out so silently. Instead, they redoubled their efforts to find new weapons to destroy the Old Ones and achieve what they sought so passionately, the secret to immortality. During their research for new weapons, they became aware of creatures living from the destructive solar radiation from their sun. These life forms were named the Satan, star gods in the Necrontyr's language. And the Satan at this early time were not particularly aware of anything beyond their need to absorb raw energy and power. Their godlike energy seemed nearly invincible to the Necrontyr, the perfect weapon to unleash against the Old Ones, but if only they could harness that power. And they did through their living metal. They constructed bodies, empty husks, shells for the Satan to inhabit. And it's unknown how they contacted the Satan initially, but through some means they encouraged the Satan to take physical form using the living metal bodies that were constructed. Now, a Satan known as the Deceiver spoke with Zarek, the Silent King, Lord of the Necrontyr Triarch, and told him how long ago the Old Ones and Satan had also been at war, but the Satan were defeated and scattered. This common foe brought the Necrontyr and Satan to a close alliance, and the Necrontyr began to worship them as gods for their supreme power. But as the Satan, once without conception of the world around them, became more manifest and intelligent, it was clear they were not the salvation that had been hoped for. The Satan offered Zarek an offer for his race: immortality. But this was not to be the immortality of the Old Ones, but that of living metal shells that they had created for the Satan. They proposed that a great period of biotransference would take place to give all Necrontyr that which they craved most: unending life. In his desperation for victory, glory and immortality, the Necrontyr Zarek agreed to transfer all other Necrontyrs into living metal bodies, that their flesh would be destroyed, but their minds and essence would live forever. This, however, was the biggest tragedy ever to befall the Necrontyr. Their minds were dulled to that of soulless drones, and only a few leaders maintained some semblance of their former selves, including Zarek, and it was at this time that Zarek realized he had made a terrible, terrible mistake, and doomed his entire race. The Satan turned the Necrontyr into slaves, ruling over them with extreme disregard and cruelty. The Necrontyr were extinguished from the universe forever, and the time of the Necrons had begun. But worse was still to come. We now return to the Old Ones, who during this time were largely unaware of the Necrontyr's demise, or the resurrection of their ancient enemy, the Satan. This ignorance would prove catastrophic, as the Old Ones were left with no time to prepare an adequate defense, against one of the most destructive wars in the history of the entire universe, known in the ancient history of the 41st millennium as the War in Heaven. So named, it was a war literally between gods and on a scale of unimaginable proportions, making the wars between races in the current time of Warhammer 40,000 seem like mere skirmishes by comparison. This war against the Old Ones was very different to the first. The Necrons not only had more advanced weaponry, they now were protected in their immortal living metal form, and the Old Ones' mastery of the warp and webways was continually countered by the C'tan with their immense power over the material universe. In this time, the C'tan spread out like vicious predators, consuming entire worlds, feasting on the creations of the Old Ones, who now retreated to only their strongest bastions to plan a way out of complete annihilation. And all the while, entire worlds were razed, suns extinguished, and entire star systems devoured by the uncontainable C'tan. The Old Ones had now retreated to the webway, only venturing out when it was essential, but even these once impenetrable paths were not untainted by the fury of the Necron. Facing complete extinction, the Old Ones seeded new life they hoped would protect them. These new races would have powerful psychic abilities to defend against the C'tan. The early creations were the Eldar, the Knib and the Rashan, and whilst the Eldar would live through to the current time, almost nothing is known of the fate of the Knib or the Rashan, and it's entirely possible they were destroyed completely by the C'tan and Necrons, with only the Eldar surviving this early time. Among their other creations were also those which would become mankind, beasts that lived in their own ecosystem but had no specific role defined for them by the Old Ones and were left to their own natural evolution. During these ancient times, the Eldar learnt a great many secrets of the warp from the Old Ones, who regularly visited them, mentoring them on how to control their psychic powers and learn to use the warp. Eldar legends originating from this time state that they were raised by figures of shadow and light, referring to them as First Ones. It is said they were the first to have reached into the starry night and to be older than gods, yet mortal and subject to time. They are said to have left the Eldar and returned to the sky in order to allow their charges to develop over millennia. They would return later in strange, vast vessels, but that were worn and scarred. This was of course due to them being engaged in an unending war against the C'tan, with the Old Ones returning to inspect the Eldar and judge if they were fit for the war ahead. The Old Ones are known to have aided their younger race in focusing their psychic abilities to create warp-derived entities and use them as weapons against the vampiric gods of starlight, which of course is a reference to the C'tan. Now the Eldar legends continue stating that in the time of the First Ones, now dwindling in number to the point that they lost influence among the Eldar, and without their creator's sensibility and guidance, the Eldar's psychic creations born from the warp itself changed from sentient weapons into living gods of the Immaterium, who were the very first of their kind, and this change instigated not only the final catastrophe for the First Ones, but in time would come back to haunt the Eldar themselves with apocalyptic consequences. The war in heaven continued, and by the time the Old Ones had prepared their forces, there were only 4 C'tan in existence. But swathes of other life forms in the galaxy the Old Ones had seeded were already extinguished. The Old Ones finally unleashed the new races, sending the Necrons reeling as the power of the warp was an anathema to them, and they struggled to contain the advance of this new offensive. In response, the C'tan unified for the first time in millions of years. However, now a new and devastating unforeseen side effect of the Old Ones' creations began to manifest in this period as the young race's psychic development disturbed the energies of the warp itself. And from this pure energy came mass and form, and older warp entities became predatory as the warp began to become a more hostile environment. Cracks in reality would appear, and the entities of the warp saw entry into the material universe, forcing the Old Ones again to bring about the emergence of new species to defend their final strongholds. They were now under assault from so many different directions, they barely had anywhere left to turn. Among their creations included the green-skinned ultra-violent Croc, later known as Orcs, and the technologically adept Jakiro. Now though, the Old Ones, even with their vast knowledge of creation and their near-immortal lifespan, had run out of time. With their interstellar network being breached, their greatest work and places of power being overrun by the horrific beings of the warp, tragically it manifested by the very creations that they had formed to save them. Among the most insidious of these entities were the enslavers, who penetrated and dominated the minds of the younger races in order to open portals for themselves to the material universe. The plague of enslavers was the final blow for the Old Ones, who were scattered forever, their power and knowledge destroyed. The combination of an unending onslaught from the C'tan combined with the mistakenly unleashed warp horrors led to the Old Ones' complete destruction. The surviving C'tan and Necrons had the final pleasure of seeing the demise of their most bitter enemy. Now, after the destruction of the Old Ones, Zarek, lord of the former Necron tier Triarch, as you all remember, was left biding his time, waiting until the time was right to strike and lead a Necron revolt against the C'tan. The Necrons focused the unimaginable energies of the living universe into cataclysmic weapons created from all their amassed knowledge that were too devastating for even the C'tan, the godlike C'tan, to endure. And these C'tan, near gods almost impossible to destroy entirely due to their very nature, were instead shattered across the universe into energy shards. Zarek now saw that having destroyed the C'tan, the remaining new races created by the Old Ones, such as the Eldar, were becoming more powerful, knowledgeable and dominant. The Necrons, exhausted by eons of war, could not stand against them. So rather than risk certain annihilation, he ordered that the Necrons withdraw into their tomb worlds and slumber in the Great Sleep, to reawaken 60 million years in the future and assert their dominance over the galaxy once more. The Silent King, however, did not join his people in slumber. He destroyed a protocol that allowed him to control over the Necron race and journeyed out into the void of intergalactic space, where he may not find solace but instead penance for dooming the Necrontier race in his deal with the now vanquished C'tan. It was rumoured that the final Old One survived destruction from the C'tan and Necrons. This survivor hid away where he continued his old ways of tweaking, dabbling and prodding around. Now we'll discuss about what he may have been doing in future content. When he was done with his work, he departed into the warp in order to hide and watch as the Old Ones knew the warp intimately. As the Necrons now retreated into stasis until this time of cataclysm had ended, the lesser creations of the Old Ones, such as mankind, continued their own paths of development, to eventually rise as powerful forces in their own right. The mantle of galactic dominion would now pass to the Eldar, but the Eldar would survive where the Old Ones did not, and would see the last Necrons depart into their great sleep after they had turned on the C'tan. Now that concludes our history of the Old Ones in Warhammer 40,000. This really is the foundation for all events that would follow and sets a lot of facts and implications into future events. So join me next time as we discover what the Eldar do with 60 million years of time on their hands. Thanks for watching today, guys. As always, I need your support. Please get involved in the comments. Tell me what you thought about this video. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you then. The Eldar, created by the Old Ones, who were the most knowledgeable beings in the universe, but were destroyed in a fanatical genocide by the Necrons and C'tan. The Eldar stood victorious, the unlikely benefactors in a war of unimaginable proportions, and now found their race in complete dominion of the known universe. Now just to mention again, as I did on the previous video, that the time we are dealing with here, as with much of the history in the 40k universe, is near speculation at best. After millions of years, facts and history are inclined to become cloudy. The Eldar history is one steeped in mythology and legend, so it's fair to say that you could lend some artistic license around the events of this period. As the lore of 40k is also very complicated, we'll learn today about the ancient history of the Eldar up to the 41st millennium. I'll then cover their race of the current period in a separate video. The war in heaven was over, and the Eldar stood unopposed in the universe. In this time we're speaking of the ancient Eldar. This is an important distinction to make between the modern Eldar of the 41st millennium. Ancient Eldar held a different mindset and outlook on their lives, and with good reason. Reason that we'll look at in due course. The ancient Eldar had been crafted and refined by the old ones for one purpose alone, and that was to destroy their enemy with vast psychic ability. It is possible that the Eldar gods spoken of at this time were actually weapons created by the old ones for them to wield. This is the version that I subscribe to. As a result of their naturally powerful psychic ability from the old one's intelligent design, the Eldar are gifted with also unnaturally long lives by humanoid standards and intellects which would enable them to create some of the most precious and complex technological advances in the universe. The next events are particularly confusing. In essence, the Eldar gods, which it appears were initially immense psychic weapons created by the ancient Eldar with guidance from the old ones. They became living gods, such was their immense psychic energy and connection to the Eldar. The Eldar of the current day seem to have lost through the mists of time and their mythology this fact that the gods they worship were potentially created by themselves, albeit in their earliest, most ancient form, either directly or indirectly. Each of the gods was known to gift the Eldar a trait and be part of their development. Eldar mythology states that Azuran gave the Eldar wisdom so that they may know themselves. Isha gave the Eldar love so they may know one another. Vol gave the Eldar the artifice as a means to make their dreams become realities. Lilith gave the Eldar joy so they'd be happy in their lives. Kurnus gave them the ability to desire so that they would prosper. Murayheg gave the Eldar foresight so that they would know their place in the world. And lastly, Cain gave the Eldar anger so that they may have a means to defend their gifts. It then becomes even more complicated though. The Eldar in their legends refer to a time of war between their own gods as the War in Heaven. Now this is particularly confusing as you remember that the war between the Old Ones, Necron and Satan is also referred to as the War in Heaven. Now it seems likely that these events occurred during a period of cataclysmic war across the universe and at the same time have caused this period to have a blurred point of reference. Now when you consider this is all meant to have taken place some 60 million years ago, it seems very feasible that this would occur. The Eldar have focused more on their own gods in this time than the events between the Old Ones and Necron-Satan alliance. Given that the Eldar lost respect and communication with the Old Ones during the war, this would make sense, and that they potentially could lose some information about the period through the vast timescale and various events that have befallen them. Instead, they're focusing on the mythological aspect and their own gods, which are arguably of much more importance to the collective Eldar consciousness. The legend of the Eldar gods is very much one of mythology, so I'll cover that in a smaller subsidiary video. What I will say is that there was a period of strife amongst the Eldar gods' pantheon. You'll hear that word a lot in reference to the Eldar gods. It simply refers to a council or circle. Think of the Greek gods of Olympus. Now this dark period of bloodshed and war was not just among the gods, but also against the Eldar themselves. This not only divided the Eldar from their gods, ceasing their ability to guide them. This period was a disaster in many ways, but the whole series of events was caused by a misreading of foresight borne by one of the gods. Now this miscalculation, in my opinion, actually doomed not only the gods themselves, but also the entire Eldar race, and I'll elaborate on all this in a future mythology video and what its implications were. Now, as I said before, the origin of the Eldar gods is one of speculation, but I believe that these were weapons gifted by the Old Ones, or at least guided in creating them for the Eldar, and were masses of incredible psychic power. But when eventually the Eldar were left without the influence of the Old Ones, who had by then been extinguished, these masses changed from mere weapons to sentient life forms, the gods of Eldar civilization. Remembering that these powers were first created to combat the Satan, gods powerful enough to devour stars themselves. It stands to reason that the psychic weapons created for or by the ancient Eldar could transition to powerful entities within the Eldar race, given their immense psychic force. Whilst we refer to them as weapons, it is not to say necessarily that they would have just been offensive. They could have been shielding, protective, or informative. And given the specific nature and description of each of the Eldar gods, I'm inclined to think that this is the case, and that these so-called weapons each had a function to bolster the Eldar in combating essentially what was an invincible army. So just to recap, during the earliest days of the Eldar, the Old Ones had helped them to develop and craft their psychic powers, knowledge, and skills. Over time though, and because of the war in heaven, the Eldar were left more and more to themselves to develop and advance. When the Old Ones were destroyed, they were at the point where they left entirely to forge their own way forward in the universe. After the war in heaven, that was the war of unimaginable proportions. Once that finished, and the Eldar had defeated the Necrons, the C'tan were shattered across the universe by the Necrons, who then retreated into their tomb worlds, leaving the Eldar as the most powerful force in the universe, with forces able to crush any who opposed them. An obvious comparison to this would be the Roman Empire in its advancement and strength over any other society at this time. Now, this situation obviously leaves the Eldar in an advantageous position in terms of societal advancement and growth. And grow they did, both in their technology, population, and most importantly their collective psychic power. Another problem at this time for the Eldar would be their gods, who were powerful psychic creatures and had up until now aided and guided the Eldar. Some of the more powerful ancient Eldar, like the earliest of their race, spoke to these gods in first-person terms and even fought against them. But all of this was to end. The gods were no longer entities that were able to assist and help shape the Eldar as they once had. Now they could only be contacted through spirit stones and help guide them in a much lesser way. So the Eldar would now enter a period of previously unequaled growth, a golden age in which they would spread their knowledge and culture wider than any that had gone before it. Such was their own dominance that over millennia they filled themselves with a great arrogance, a sense that all other races were below them, and all around them stood evidence of this, both in their technological success, their psychic powers, the beauty with which they inhabited new worlds far and wide. They were at the pinnacle of achievement, both technologically, culturally, and in the size of their empire. They not only lived long lives, but when they did die, their souls would return to the collective ether to be reborn into a new body, a psychic reincarnation. This enabled the Eldar to achieve a height of cultural technology that would nor could ever be equaled again. Over the vast periods of time involved here, literally millions of years, the Eldar reigned supreme. Their strength, pride, arrogance, and avarice grew. Their sensibility and self-control waned and became less and less. Their race was so advanced that they no longer needed to perform any physical or menial tasks, nor did they need to work to support their society. Their only causes were either self-betterment, the pursuit of knowledge, and most often of all, to indulge their desires, no matter how extreme. Now, whilst this may seem a deplorable thing, you must remember that the Eldar have far more powerful and overbearing emotions than humans, and this would lead them to indulging in ever more perverse ways to satisfy their desires, both through violence, cruelty, torture, sex, depravity. It became harder and harder for these extreme fanatics dedicated to dark pleasures to satisfy their decadent desires. So their acts became more violent and more creative. Soon, the streets were literally running with blood, and the insane bloodlusting roar of the swathes of citizens could be heard throughout the Eldar Empire. Now, as you become desensitized to something over time, you have to push it further and further to achieve any enjoyment from it at all. And the Eldar in their lives, where they had literally nothing other to do at this time than pleasure addiction, was like a disease infecting the whole of the Eldar race. The Eldar slaughtered one another at the slightest whim and feasted on the corpses of their fellow kin. All the while, the world burned around them. Cults dedicated to nightmarish depravity grew rapidly across the Eldar society. Whole lands fell to the different aspects of arcane knowledge and sensual excesses. Billions upon billions of Eldar, numbers greater than you can possibly imagine, spread across worlds throughout the universe, all cascading towards the darkest epitome of emotional worship. Even before this time, it had been prophesied that the Eldar would fall. The Old Ones warned the Eldar about it, but their predictions and warnings were forgotten, dismissed, and ignored over time. However, it is not to say that all was a hopeless mess of suffering and exorbitant pleasures. Whilst many had slid into chasms of depravity, there were many who focused still on improvement, development, and the core tenets of the Eldar race. Discoveries by the Imperium of Man have found hints at just how far the Eldar had advanced with their technology. One of these ancient devices enabled the user to literally will anything they could imagine into existence, drawing on their vast psychic powers. If you could imagine legions of Eldar guardians that would appear and be real and physical and have mass, you could build endless streams of fleets, even whole cities. Whatever your imagination could be, you could create it using this highly advanced device. But on discovery of this device, it was deemed unusable. It had been tainted by the forces of chaos, of darkness. The idea of using such a device of such devastating power, that whilst it had been touched by chaos, is an unthinkable one for the Imperium. It goes to show, though, just how far the Eldar had developed, and who knows what other advantages of similar genius they had created, but have since lost. This period of wonder and decadence, however, could not last. Some saw it coming, although perhaps not quite understanding the gravity of what was to come. A group of Eldar known as Exodites concluded that the Eldar had grown to disgusting excess, and so left the homeworlds to live on fringe planets in a more sustainable, pure existence. At this time, a great many more of the Eldar began to grow uneasy with the numbers and severity of the degradation of their society. Their seers, who had powerful precognition, warned that this dark path would lead surely to evil and suffering for the entire race. Yet more Eldar left the homeworlds of their empire, considering the remaining society unsalvageable and beyond help. They built great starships so massive they were near artificial planets. These are referred to as craft worlds. Some of the strongest Eldar stayed on the homeworlds to selflessly try and alter the path their race had taken, believing it to be not too late to save their society of beauty from whatever horrors would lay ahead. Surely the Eldar could not be destroyed. How could the Guardians of the Galaxy fall when they had the most advanced technology, the most knowledge and power? So you see, the ancient Eldar had drifted from guidance by the Old Ones too early. And despite the warnings from the Old Ones, the sense of what could happen was never truly instilled into them. This, combined with the fact that their own gods took over as the primary religion within the Eldar, meant they lost and ignored the truth of what they could face if they did not control their extremely powerful emotions. Remember that the Eldar were created for one purpose: to destroy the Necrons and Satan through the use of psychic power and warp manipulation. They all have a powerful link to the warp, this parallel dimension of malleable energy. Over millions upon millions of years of sliding towards depravity, the Eldar's psychic emanations began to create form. This was continually added to and strengthened as things became progressively worse in the Eldar Empire. Souls of departed Eldar cultists and sacrifices forming a massive ball of negative psychic energy. This would cause such an imbalance within the warp dimension, it would actually create the immense psychic storms which humanity at this time would define as the Age of Strife. Without understanding it, they actually had a massive effect on other races at the time. The Eldar still had their webways to travel through the universe, but for any other races, interstellar travel and communication was rendered impossible by the high level of disturbance in the warp energy. This would last for millions of years and a hugely disruptive event for many other races. So, thanks for that, Eldar. But despite the most selfless efforts of the strongest Eldar back on Homeworld, and the cause for the endless emotional excesses to end, it barely abated. It became worse and worse, a downward spiral of disastrous proportions. Now, to any big society, this kind of horrific abuse would be a problem, but it was worse than could have been imagined for the Eldar. This mass of psychic energy that had been growing in the warp was now to reach a point of criticality. It would explode as it transformed inert psychic energy to a living consciousness of pure hate, suffering, and decadence, a reflection of the Eldar's millions of years of societal abuse and hedonism given nightmarish form. The psychic scream of the birth of Slaanesh was to be so powerful it would literally rip the fabric of the universe in two. It tore the souls of the Eldar within 1,000 light years, slaughtering the greatest number of Eldar in an instant. No one knows the figures involved in this loss, but it could be no less than trillions of lives, not to mention all of their homeworlds, and some of the craftworlds who had not even travelled far enough were annihilated in an instant. Their research and technology destroyed, the wonders in their culture, which had stood for millennia, obliterated. The Eldar gods, who despite being separated from the Eldar still cared and protected their followers, tried to combat and defeat Slaanesh, but all were slain or shattered, apart from just a couple of their gods who managed to escape the horror. The Eldar had truly lost everything in an instant. Only those who sheltered at distance in the wraithbone hulls of the craftworlds and exodite planets were spared, leaving a mere fragment of the Eldar behind. The Eldar race did not just fall at this time, it was nearly wiped from existence. The only other survivors were ironically the Dark Eldar. I'll make mention of this specific Eldar group another time, but the Dark Eldar were essentially a cult or a mix of cults who worshipped the most purely depraved side of the Eldar. They were part of the many who orchestrated the fall of the Eldar. They had created a home for themselves within the Eldar webway, and this protected them from the immense shockwave as Slaanesh came into being. But this was only the beginning. The horror of what had occurred would not only haunt the Eldar for many millennia, but it would also unleash unseen nightmares into the reality of the world. Until this time, dark forces from within the warp could only transition to reality by channeling themselves through a psyker or being summoned as so. With the warp and reality torn apart, these two now merged, and the horrors of the warp could easily bleed into the material universe, corrupting, destroying, and ravaging. It is also said that the Eldar homeworlds still exist, lost within the realm of the warp and chaos, suffering a never-ending nightmare of their own making of pure, demonic suffering for any Eldar who remain there. The tear in the warp dimension and reality would be known from this point onward as the Eye of Terror, and gave birth to the gateway for the myriad of forces known as Chaos. This devastating event had a wide-reaching effect on all races in the galaxy, and was far from over in the history of the universe of 40k. Since this time of darkness, which the Eldar refer to as the Fall, it is spoken of understandably with sadness and humiliation. The Eldar are now broken and a scattered race, lacking a sense of unity and coordinated objective. The Exodite world saw all of these events confirm that their choice to abandon the ways of technology and hedonism was the right one, and consequently they've slipped into a more primitive technological level of subsistence and just existence. Happy in its simplicity and with no interest for the power that caused their destruction. The survivors of the Eldar homeworlds who had foresight enough to abandon their planets now drift through the stars in colossal nomad fleets, and the more strict and organised of these are the craftworlds. Created prior to the fall with the mission to preserve the true Eldar way of life, they are loaded with life forms, culture from their planet in both religion, biology, technology and politics. Each of these craftworlds remains independent of the others, and they have no commitments to one another. They will often ally one another in times of need, but their society is very much shattered from the days of the ancient Eldar and is just a shadow of its former glory. The process of reincarnation that the Eldar once revered is also no longer possible, as they discovered after the fall that Slaanesh would snatch and devour their souls at the point of death. This prospect brings utter terror to the Eldar, where once they did not fear death, as they knew their spirit would be reincarnated and their life's knowledge preserved. Now it could be ripped and consumed by the chaos god Slaanesh. To counter this horror, the Eldar developed spirit stones. These are the red orbs you'll see adorning Eldar armor, vehicles and weapons. The purpose is to absorb and store an Eldar soul at the point of death, so that it can be then placed into a Craftworld infinity circuit as a life source of information for the Eldar, and to save that soul from Slaanesh, ever watching, always desiring. Now the Eldar have been greatly changed by the fall, and their society is still reeling from the sheer scale of the horror it created for itself. And all the while Slaanesh is constantly stalking. They can never escape, and that's what they fear more than anything. But Eldar prophecies state, though, that one day their gods, some of whom were consumed and destroyed by Slaanesh, others were lost long ago during the Eldar War in Heaven. It is said that they will one day rise again as the saviours of the Eldar, to see them take their place as the rulers of the galaxy once again. Whilst this might seem a hope of a doomed race, it's not out of the realms of possibility. The Eldar are one of the most powerful races when it comes to psychic powers, and the Eldar gods, as you remember, were weapons designed by the Old Ones to combat the C'tan. So it's not somehow out of the realm of possibility that there's some truth to this. The Eldar gods could recombine, resurrect from the depths of the warp. If it were to happen, then perhaps this period of ruin among the Eldar would be viewed more as penance than actually as ruin. Now the Eldar had been shattered by these events and were left significantly weakened. To date, their fall had the largest impact obviously on themselves. But it's worth to keep in mind that the Eldar were the ones who originally caused the Necrons to retreat into their tomb worlds. They had since then grown in strength many times over. But since the fall, all of this was lost, leaving them significantly weaker and more scattered than ever at the end of the War in Heaven. This could still have far-reaching consequences as the universe of the 41st millennium faces new threats from the awakening Necron and the invasive Tyranid hives. The Eldar story is one which is far more significant than sometimes is given credit, and whilst many other empires are stronger than the Eldar in the current time, none are even close to what the Eldar had achieved with their own. The reality of the other younger and less powerful races such as mankind, Tau, Orcs, facing some of the most nightmarish forces in the universe is a sobering prospect. The Eldar, if their prophecies of godlike resurrection and intervention prove accurate, could be the last true hope for the universe. We'll be moving on from the Eldar now to look at mankind and the Imperium and their place in the universe. But we will revisit the Eldar in the future videos to look at their society, their weapons, their gods and much more. So guys, please leave your thoughts below, and as always, please support me by rating the video, commenting and checking out my previous content. I need as much support as possible with this series, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time when we learn more about the future of human history. There once was a man born in a forgotten time, created by a force of unknown origin. He would cross the ages knowing his one purpose: to lead humanity as the greatest empire in the galaxy, the Imperium of Man. In this time he would be known by only one name: the Emperor of Mankind. this is Lutin. I must first apologise for the length of time since the last project. The simplest explanation is it took me a long time to compile amid many other things going on for me. So we now move on from the Eldar history and wade into one of the most important and complicated narratives in the universe of the 41st millennium. It is, of course, the rise of humanity and the Imperium. In the dark, never-ceasing war that is the future, humans have risen to control and maintain a galaxy-spanning empire whose official title is the Imperium of Mankind. The Imperium is the largest and most powerful political entity in the galaxy. It has been established for a period of some 10,000 years up to its present date in the age of Warhammer 40k. The lore and scripture around this period is massive. Despite this daunting task though, I've decided to interpret it in one piece chronologically, splitting it into chapters so as to best enable you guys to get an understanding and a grasp of what it is all about. This is the third video in my Warhammer 40,000 lore series, and it seeks to create a foundation for all of the further videos which talk about the Imperium of Man. The Imperium of Man consists of the planets, systems and forces throughout the galaxy which contain Imperial citizens and their derivatives. Not all humans are universally members of the Imperium though, and as you would expect there are rogue traders and those who choose to live on the legal fringes of the society. The single most important figure within the Imperium is the aforementioned founder, saviour and ruler of this empire, known as the Emperor of Mankind. He formed the Imperium some 10,000 years previous to the current established date in the universe of Warhammer 40,000 at the end of the 30th millennium. This occurred following an especially brutal period of societal disintegration during the last days of the Age of Strife. In this video, I'll outline the political state that is the Imperium, as well as the history behind how humanity reached this point in the far future. As with anything though, the complexity and depth of the lore means I can't cover it in its fleshed entirety, so some tangents are going to have to remain for future videos, but I do my best to cover as much as possible which is relevant. The Emperor of Man sits as an extremely powerful figure within the Imperium. Make no mistake, he is the centre of humanity in the 41st millennium. So powerful a humanoid, he was arguably barely human to begin with, and he continues to protect mankind after his mortal wounding during the final battles of a period known as the Horus Heresy. Were it not for his ever-present psychic voice reaching out, searching, protecting and planning, then the Imperium of Man would undoubtedly fall back into dark oblivion, and perhaps the light would be extinguished permanently. The Emperor was injured so badly after the heresy that he now exists only as a husk of a man within a stasis chamber called the Golden Throne. This allows him to live on eternally as he has done for some past 10,000 years, whilst continually guiding mankind through psychic whispers. The only catch with this is thousands of psykers are sacrificed every day using their essence and psychic power to keep him alive, as he is heavily protected and attended to back on the ancient homeworld of legend, Terra, or Old Earth. The Imperium of Man in the wider galaxy now consists of many systems, planets and trillions of citizens. All the while the Imperial military and the many administrators of mankind, all of whom swear allegiance to the Emperor, all stand together against the nightmares of the galaxy to form what is humanity in the darkest of futures. Now we know that in this future we have access to highly advanced technology and face many voracious enemies wielding our own forces to then counter them. The important question in understanding the Imperium is how did we get to this time? And to understand this, we need to look back at the extensive and dark history of humanity. There is a small clue as to the way in which the people that constitute humanity in the 41st millennium view their past. That is, the Imperial two-headed eagle, the crest of the Imperium. It stands with its two heads, but with one eye closed. Blind, or perhaps refusing to see the past. The other eye is open, looking to the future. The logic being that the past of humanity is too painful or dangerous to look back on, so we look forward, striving to be stronger and more powerful as we have done for thousands of years. There are distinct ages of humanity's history, and these tell the story of how we reached the time of the Imperium. 1 millennium equals 1,000 years. The Imperium has now been established for 10 millennia or 10,000 years. Humanity has existed for roughly 41,000 years. This timeline demonstrates the ages of man through this period, from our ancient history through to the age of the Imperium. We have the ancient history, the age of terror, the golden age of technology or the dark age of technology, the age of strife, the unification wars, the Great Crusade and the fall of the Eldar, the Horus Heresy and the Great Scouring, followed by the final age of Imperium of man. The ancient history tells of the dawn of mankind, but this period is largely one of animalistic evolution. The most significant event occurs around 7000 BC. This event marks the birth of the humanoid, who would become the Emperor of Mankind. His origins are something of a heated debate among the 40k community. There are several theories around this, and it's important to note that something I rarely see stated on forums or discussions around the origins of the Emperor is that quite simply no one knows the origins of the Emperor. It's all just speculation. Simply because one theory has had a vague reference at one time or another does not make it gospel. In fact, as I've repeated before, the crux of the matter with imperial history and lore in general is that very little should ever be considered official or canon. Such is the state of the loss of history, misinformation, and suppression of facts within the 40k universe. So essentially, the correct version is the version you want to believe. In a universe where history is stored over thousands of years and in times of unimaginable devastation and strife, it's unlikely something could be considered a cold, hard fact, especially when you're talking about events that happened in ancient history in an age where accurate recording of information seems unlikely or even impossible to have survived. The first version of these events is the often widely accepted background, which states that in the ancient times, some humans carried a natural affinity or awareness of the warp. These were the earliest psykers. They would be village shamans or witch doctors in ancient communities. Their premonitions led them to understand that in the future, mankind would face the darkest of times. Their decided course of action would be to commit ritual suicide en masse, returning their souls and essence to the warp to then coalesce and be reborn as one supremely powerful psychic being. This being would then spend the future millennia living a Highlander-like existence, transitioning from identity to identity, sometimes taking on famous leaders in history to steer humanity in the right direction. And then upon reaching the Age of Strife, he would step into the Four to become the supreme leader of all humanity and unite us again throughout the galaxy. Now, some people take this as the most canon version of the Emperor's origin, but there are various others, including the one that I actually personally subscribe to. The shaman story is all very well and good, but it leaves me with some questions. For example, if these shaman were some of the earliest humans with only a vague awareness of the warp, how could they have such powerful precognition to foresee the need to create such a super being? In addition to that, if they were truly the earliest stowings of psychers for humanity, then surely they would not have been especially powerful, and even with their powers combined, how could they summon humanity's greatest champion? No, not Captain Planet. So, those two things stand out for me. Also, their plan to commit mass suicide and then hope that they would all be reborn together seems pretty spurious. It seems to tick the boxes from an okay, I guess that's possible point of view, but it just doesn't make sense beyond that. Another theory is that the Emperor was in fact one of the Old Ones, who you will remember were one of the most ancient super beings who created the Eldar, the Orcs, and even humanity. Yes, really, go and look it up for those naysayers who think that they did not. This theory, again, at first is captivating, until you start to think about it more. And then you realise it doesn't really make any sense. The Old Ones were, as far as we are informed, not shapeshifters, but creatures of light and dark. There was a statement to the fact that just a single Old One escaped the brutal genocide of their race, but then was eventually killed at the birth of Slaanesh when the Eldar fell. If the Emperor was some other escaped Old One, it doesn't make logical sense that they would choose one race and then ultimately lead it. Although I suppose, devil's advocate, who's to say what will be going in the mind of this Old One after his entire race was extinguished? Maybe it had a crisis of conscience. Anything, I guess, is possible. And then not to mention also the fact that the Emperor would lead humanity to wage war on pretty much every other alien race, which wouldn't really serve any purpose within the context of an Old One's mission statement. They were originally life givers. They seeded planets with life to, create new races in the universe. And again, unless it had simply lost the plot and was operating on his own sort of mission plan. There are some things that do fit this theory though, such as Old Ones being very powerful psychic creatures. They had extended precognition, they had very extensive, almost immortal long life, and they would have the ability to genetically manipulate humans. But all of this seems very soft and is only plausible at best. For me, this theory just doesn't really fit. So the last theory, and the one that I personally believe, is that the Emperor was neither the creation of some bizarre suicide pact or an Old One, rather something in between. It's fair to say that in any ancient history nothing is quite as it's written, and that some reading between the lines is necessary. The most ancient of history available hints that the last remaining Old One floated around the galaxy, meddling and dabbling and trying to have some last impact on the worlds which they felt they had failed and left their race completely annihilated. We know that the Old Ones were capable of creating beings of immense psychic power. This is how the ancient Eldar defeated the Necrons and Satan, who were, let's not forget, gods capable of devouring stars. So the theory I stand by is that a fragmented remaining Old One drifted around the galaxy until he was struck by a precognition so terrible that he had no choice but to resolve becoming involved. It could be that he saw the vision of the Eldar fall or the rise of chaos. Either way, he knew that the Eldar were by now far too arrogant to accept any help and would be of no use, remembering that the Eldar had turned their backs on the Old Ones long ago. The Orcs, who were also an Old One's creation, they were too crass and mindless for such preparation. Instead, he would turn to the weak humans. Weak, but with great potential. And so he would decide on forming a divine creature, a humanoid of the most immense power, but birthed in such a way that he would not allow those humans would not immediately view him as a god, but as a man, to be not worshipped, but instill a sense of power, of awe, of destiny. There are other clues as well. Apparently, further along in Earth's ancient history, a creature crashed to Earth who had an appearance we would describe as a dragon. It would seem, though, that this dragon was in fact a small fragment of the star gods, the Satan, who had been destroyed thousands of light years away by the Necrons. Even a tiny fragment of these most powerful beings would be beyond the means of even the most powerful humans to contain. The future Emperor in this time wounded this creature and then apparently took it to Mars. I'm not sure how, but there it lay imprisoned within the planet. The final chapter of that story, that's one for another day. Still though, this helps to secure the idea that no mere reincarnation of a few shaman could produce such or perform such a task. Could an Old One? Perhaps, but given the other evidence I would still discount it. But a perfectly designed humanoid of godlike form created by an Old One who would know a most powerful psychic being was needed to counter not just the future darkness of man, but to face again the Satan and the day of reckoning when the Necrons would rise again. This seems for me the most logical and plausible of origins. The truth though is that we cannot know the origin of the Emperor unless some definitive tome is discovered which provides secure evidence as to such, so we are left to speculate until then. One thing that is certain though is that the Emperor was a human and holds godlike psychic power. He was within humanity throughout all of history, learning, sometimes guiding, mostly sitting in the shadows, until he was needed to take a course of action that would lead us into the age of the Imperium. The last point worthy of mention is that the Emperor of Man would enforce a strictly secular society. In the early days of the Imperium, this would then enable humanity would identify with him as a man and not as a god. They wouldn't project any religious connotations onto him. Also, because throughout the thousands of years he spent on Earth, he would see the terrible devastation and fragmentation organized religion could cause. He believed that humanity could only achieve its full potential in a strictly secular state. However, even in the crusading period where the Emperor would reunite the lost colonies of man, some people began to spread rumours that he was more than just a powerful man. These beliefs would run so strong it would even question some Astartes to the faith. such as Battle Captain Nathaniel Garrow, one of my favourite characters in the 40k and one of the few Space Marines from the Death Guard chapter not to be corrupted by chaos. Some citizens of the Imperium consider the Emperor's stance on faith even a test, so as to distinguish those who can see the whole of the truth, that he is in fact the one true God of mankind. We would now reach the time known as the Age of Terror. This was the period on Earth from the 1st to the 15th millennia, that is the first 15,000 years on old Earth. A period of extreme technological expansion, from a pre-industrial era to that of fusion power and travel beyond our planet and even solar system. Humanity would first colonize new worlds within our system, first on Mars and then the moons of Jupiter, before mankind would start to look at how we could travel beyond. To achieve this next goal, colossal starships were created for humanity to cross the voids between solar systems, and powerful engines at this time. These advanced fusion drives enabled very fast but still sublight travel. This meant in order to reach their destination, it could take anything as long as 10 generations of human lifespan to reach their destinations. Subsequently, trade and aid between human colonies was then extremely difficult and would lead to them being established almost as independent states. Very little is known of this period, as imperial records are fragmented and limited. The Emperor during this time had no reason to interfere, and so would continue his own work and research back on Earth. Study and the improvement of man, all the while remaining in the shadows. During the period between the 1st and 15th millennium, various events of discovery and importance took place that would finally propel us to create our first interstellar confederation in the 15th millennium. One of the most important events of note would be during M4. Humanity would discover the warp and begin to research it. This is specifically relevant as it would have been one of the discoveries that would lead the Emperor to understanding the necessity of him coming into the fore. As we reach the 15th millennium, humanity would enter a golden age of technology. This would be the highest point in mankind's technological achievements. It would last for some 10,000 years, and humanity continued its rise in technology, science and power, spreading and colonizing mankind all across the Milky Way galaxy. We could create our first galactic empire, ruled from Earth, the homeworld, and establish massive trade networks that further powered expansion and advancement. This earlier period in the Age of Technology has a subtitle known as the Stellar Exodus. This marks the time when humanity made its first colonies on other worlds, and also beyond the solar system. These initial colonies were reached using the ships that were still only capable of sublight speeds and were restricted by this, as well as our developing but limited knowledge of building these vast scale ships. When these ships reached their destination though, they would be then slowly deconstructed and their materials used to build the colonies. Some would become manufactorums capable of producing massive war machines, or then back then defensive machines, things such as Imperial Knights and even Titans, which the colonies would use to defend themselves against the dangers of the galaxy. In a comparable way to early colonies on Earth, this meant they had to be self-sufficient, and due to the large timescales involved before anyone would likely reach out to them again, they would develop their own cultures and languages, largely influenced by the noble families established on these interstellar voyages, as well as physical elements on the new homeworld. The planet's characteristics would also shape the way in which their societies would evolve. Now, some 6,000 years later, around the period of Millennium 21, mankind now began a process of militarization. It is not known who or for what reason created this process or started it off, but along with our expansion and colonization of planets, we also began to expand and develop our weapons and forces. Fragments of what was developed during this age of technology, such as Imperial Knights, Titans, Land Raider designs and so on, would later be recovered by the Imperium far into the future. The largest proportion, however, would be lost to the tides of time, and we can only imagine or hope to continue recovering these lost and most powerful of technologies in the 41st millennium. Humanity had risen to a period of immense power through our technology. And whilst the Emperor of Man existed, he had not made himself known to mankind. He continued to bide his time, lying in the shadows, studying, planning, observing. The very fact that the Emperor is one of the few who would live through this time and on into the Age of the Imperium, and this would then have far-reaching implications for humanity, as the Emperor would carry his knowledge and strength of this golden age into a time when none would recall it, and where it would be of critical importance to our survival. For the Emperor, he would use this knowledge of the Age of Technology to bring humanity back to a glimmer of what once had been. In the thousands of years where humanity established its first interstellar empire, we would become, as much as the Eldar, supremely dependent on technology. Humankind had risen to a level of godlike understanding, and this was embraced and practiced by the people of the time. The Empire of Mankind was seen as a bastion of technological achievement and began to use a new class of humans entitled the Navigators to expand our reach and use the newly discovered warp to travel beyond the distances of existing star drives and cover vast distances in a short time. A navigator's role is to, as the name suggests, protect and guide a ship through the tides and dangers of the warp. Eventually, over time, humanity would find the warp had become too turbulent to traverse. But in this time, navigators, they're not strictly psychers as such. They possess a special gene called, unsurprisingly, the navigator gene. They also possess other abnormal characteristics, including a third eye in the forehead, as well as some more alien appearances such as no pupils in their human eyes and translucent skin, as well as maybe larger than normal appendages. Their origin is believed to have not been a natural development, but to have come about through genetic experimentation and engineering in this period of the Age of Technology. It was likely that mankind discovered the warp and that it could be utilised for crossings, but that required a safe means to traverse it and looked to create a solution to that problem. Mankind's age of expansion and technological glory across the galaxy would lead to many worlds requiring their own localised defence forces. In this time, humanity's mastery of technology was largely unequalled, and this would be employed in the defence and relative growth of the colonies. One of these defence forces, one of the most powerful of them, would be the Imperial Knights. These were colossal war machines that towered over all they surveyed on a battlefield. They were built with the knowledge of the Golden Age of technology, and these giants survived until the Imperial Age, but they can essentially no longer be constructed from scratch. And as is often the case with technology in the Imperium, it is now merely maintained. The Imperial Knights themselves were operated by nobles from the colony worlds who would be entombed within them. They are sworn to protect their citizens from all Xenos threats and the endless nightmares in the universe. As the Knights would advance into the later ages, they continued their noble values and morals. Some of the Knights are the most selfless and dedicated forces within the Imperium, as well as being some of the oldest. As with most technology from the Dark or Golden Age technology, the Knights are immensely powerful, allowing them to run and fight as much as a dreadnought would fight, but on a much larger scale. These ancient heroes have fought thousands of battles across millennia and stand ready to defend Imperial citizens and support Astartes anywhere in the galaxy. After the Knights we have the Titans, and Titans are the epic war machines of the Imperium. A Knight and the smallest Titan can be anything like 9-10 meters, but the big Titans can be anything up to 50 meters. They are gargantuan death machines. Many people believe that the Mechanicum were originally responsible for creating the Titans. This is not strictly correct. They do construct some Titans, but many they simply maintain. This is because the technology used to create Titans is very, very old, and like many things in the universe of Warhammer 40,000 for the Imperium, a lot of technology is merely maintained because of its complexity. Simpler devices are constructed, but this happens less and less. But the Mechanicum do create some Titans for the Imperium. Originally, the Mechanicus found versions that were completely autonomous, created in the Golden Age of technology. And the largest Titan so far discovered was upon the lost forge world of Charania. It was a completely autonomous war machine and was dubbed the Castigator class Titan. Its schematic was apparently also contained within a standard template construct on this planet, and it was far superior to any class of Titan utilised by the Adeptus Mechanicus or any other intelligent race in the galaxy. This was so far the only known discovered Castigator class Titan, but it was subsequently destroyed by Imperial Grey Knights. Grey Knights are the secretive and unbreakable order of Astartes warriors dedicated to the protection of the Imperium from the very darkest foes that humanity faces in the 41st millennium. Now, the portion of the STC database containing the data for the manufacture of the Castigator class Titan was also destroyed by the Mechanicus. It possessed AI, which is strictly outlawed and heretical within the Imperium. Secondly, it had somehow long ago been corrupted by living chaos energy, and for this reason it could obviously no longer be supported. Imperial records of this event, though, note that the cost of life and resources required to destroy this Titan monstrosity was severe. The key point here, though, is that mankind was developing machines in the golden age of technology that would never again be equalled. They could be merely copied, emulated, or used as a template to work from in the future. But our level of knowledge, our rules and guides on what could be created, due in part to events that were yet to come, would very much limit humanity's advancement in the millennia that lay ahead. I mentioned a moment ago something called an STC. This denotes a device known as a standard template construct. These are one of the single most valuable objects in the galaxy for the Imperium, and their importance was no less during the Age of Technology. So what is an STC? STC systems were advanced AI computers created during the Golden or Dark Age of Technology, and are said to have contained the sum total of human, scientific and technological knowledge. STCs were created when human interstellar civilization was at its technological peak. Their original purpose was to enable colonists to survive on the new worlds they arrived upon, as they could not carry securely the mass amount of knowledge gained by humanity at this time, and even if they could, they might not have people capable of understanding how to utilize this. The STC solved this problem. It enabled the colonies to access all of humanity's knowledge and display it in a way for them to be able to create anything they needed from the resources available and solve any issue that could arise for them on the new home worlds, no matter the geography, resource limitations or climate. This would enable them to build anything from a simple lasgun to a fortified bunker, massive war machines or an atmospheric processor. STC systems possess the ability to not just store information but also to produce new designs to meet changing circumstances. They are immensely powerful sources of information and power, and consequently the Imperium places a high value on obtaining these lost relics of ancient knowledge. Even though now, after many thousands of years had passed, most of the discovered STCs are damaged to the point they only contain fragments of their former stored information. But Imperial forces will still use any means or resources necessary to obtain an STC once it has been discovered, even if this means the sacrifice of legions of military or civilian Imperial citizens. From the golden age of technology and into the ages to come, these valuable systems will be lost or destroyed, so that now in the age of the Imperium they have become beyond rare, almost just a legend. So the consequent discovery of remnants of any new technology from the dark age of technology puts an STC's value to humanity beyond estimation. The little knowledge that has been recovered from damaged STC units is then utilised, copied and stored by the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who are based deep on the primary forge homeworld of Mars. They believe that STCs are the most holy of artifacts and will seek and protect them at any cost. This little divergence is an important one because an STC recovery, no matter its state of repair, still remains as one of the most important objectives for Imperial forces in the 41st millennium. The holy grail of this quest, though, although unlikely, would be to recover an intact STC, thereby gifting the Imperium all of the stored knowledge of mankind from the golden age of technology. If the Imperium were able to recover an STC of this standard, it would catapult the existing human society into becoming yet again one of the most advanced and significantly, if not the most powerful state in the galaxy. The STC Crusade also explains in part about the state of technology and development of the Imperium, in that much of the knowledge regarding tech is replicated or learned rather than invented and created. Although new tech does come along, it's not overtly specified why so little resources are put into research now. It could be speculated though, however, that mankind relied so strongly upon the Emperor in the last 10 millennia that now they believe only he is capable of directing mankind's advancement, and they solely focus on maintaining him and maintaining the state of imperial affairs. So we return to our story, and at this time in the golden age of technology, humanity continues to expand across the galaxy. Initially slowly, as the gigantic starships we crafted were incapable of using the warp to traverse space. And as we learned previous, they took generations to reach their destination. They were essentially travelling worlds, similar to the Eldar craft world of the 41st millennium. When these ships reached their destination, they would slowly be deconstructed, and their materials could be used to create massive war machines such as the Imperial Knights and Titans, which the colony could use to defend themselves against the dangers of the galaxy. Dangers such as the Eldar and Orcs, who were first discovered in this period as a result of our reaching out beyond our own system to more regularly explore the galaxy. However, interestingly, during this time, humanity was actually considered more powerful than it is in the 41st millennium. This strength was mainly due to our technology rather than actual physical forces, such as Astartes, who did not exist in this age. Science was humanity's primary religion, and the society of man perceived itself as having reached a time where no one could be a real challenge to us. To a degree, this was actually true, so much so that the Xenos races of Eldar and Orc actually signed non-aggression pacts with mankind, which seems bizarre from the Orc point of view, but there we are. The discovery and use of interstellar drives, that is, an engine enabling cross-warp travel, now powered humanity's expansion and domination of the galaxy forward. A federated government was formed, enabling us to create a strong trade community and, most importantly, remain unified and powerful throughout our colonies spread across the galaxy, aiding and supporting where necessary with either materials, logistics or military. The exact form and nature of this federation is unknown from this time, as so much knowledge and history was lost. To speculate though, it seems likely that from the way in which humans would live at this time, the Federation would have focused more on discovery, science and working to better humanity, as well as supporting our widespread colonies. As the societies we had seeded across the galaxy grew stronger and more developed, most humans would live long, peaceful lives where menial actions were carried out by automation, leaving people time to indulge in their own lives and dedicate themselves to the glorious expansion of mankind. This golden age of peace bears a stark contrast to the unforgiving brutality of the 41st millennium, the Imperium where many citizens are now born into lives that are shorter, work-driven, and even hellish by comparison. Back with our timeline though, and although navigators had now been discovered and enabled interstellar travel, psychers, that is humans with strong psychic ability, had for the longest time evaded or simply passed undetected. It would be in the age of technology where this new class of human would finally be identified. These psychers seemingly largely avoided the demonic possessions which had occurred for the old ones, Orc and Eldar. It is unclear why this would be, but again you may speculate that the Emperor had a role to play in guiding and shielding humanity through this time. As we know, he had always lain in the shadows, ensuring our safety and creating small influence until he felt it was necessary to come to the fore. Another possibility is that by comparison, the Orcs and Eldar with their more advanced psychic powers simply shone brighter. As we know, the demons of the warp are actually attracted to psychic power in real space like moths to a lamp, and so they appeared amid the depths of the galaxy a brighter beacon for the chaotic creatures to be attracted towards, whereas the human psychers were very early in development, their powers were less attractive, they did not stand out so much. These psychic mutations were initially limited to only a few individuals per billion or so humans, but toward the end of the age of technology, psychers would appear throughout the colonies more widespread than ever before. And some colonies who were advanced and open-minded, they could see the potential advantages brought by human psychers, and they were protected and allowed to develop and explore their abilities. However, on other, less advanced human colonies, they were often killed and hunted down as the people here feared rather than embraced their divergent powers, much of similar to witch hunts. As I hinted at earlier, one of the reasons during the golden age of technology that humanity was able to not only survive but stretch itself out to colonize and conquer worlds in the galaxy, not to mention defending itself against aggressive Xenos, would be due to their reliance on AI and the machine creations of the time. However, as nearly all science fiction dictates, these primary sentient machines in the Human Galactic Federation would be known as the Men of Iron, and they would stereotypically turn on their creators and enter us into a cataclysmic war. An STC containing a template for the Men of Iron was discovered by Imperial forces on a Chaos-controlled world. It became apparent that much as the Castigator-class Titan, the Men of Iron here had also been corrupted by Chaos, and the AI of these creations was sentient, so we can perhaps speculate that the Men of Iron initially resented their human creators, but combined with this were also corrupted, possibly by Chaos, which at the time was relatively unknown to mankind, hence the lack of any documentation to support such speculation. It is, however, a possibility and stacks up with what we know of the corruptibility of human AI creations. Also, the intent of the dark forces of Chaos to obliterate humanity once it became aware of its existence. Regardless of the reason though, this war was one of the greatest disasters to befall humanity and would rage for centuries. The exact length of the war is not recorded. The conflict was eventually won by humanity, but at a great cost. The damage caused by this conflict to interstellar human society was hugely destructive. We would lose masses of knowledge and technology, not to mention devastating humanity's economic strength and political unity. The war would begin the series of events that would lead into the collapse of the Federation of Humanity at the end of the Age of Technology. As so often is the case, very little information exists from this time, largely due to the Imperium being so wary of a similar disaster happening again. And this is why amongst the Imperium and mankind you'll find only the simplest forms of AI. It is viewed as being exceptionally dangerous technology and is strictly outlawed. A substitute is often to combine human and machine into mindless drone-like beings known as servitors. Servitors are the Imperium's cybernetic servants, lacking true self-awareness, and are created from the bodies of either condemned criminals who are unpleasantly lobotomized, or vat-grown humanoids whose bodies and brains are partially replaced with machine systems. As a result of this catastrophic conflict between the Men of Iron and humanity in the golden age of technology, it is now considered one of the most severe crimes in Imperial society to develop a self-aware, artificially intelligent machine. It is just considered too dangerous to even consider. Around Millennium 23, the warp was taking hold of psychers and wreaking havoc on human colonies. Feudal night worlds were more conservative and less abiding of psychers, as we said previously, who had hunted them down. These would fare better than the others, who had adopted them more open-mindedly at the time. The knights in their semi-titan armour would battle massive warp entities and serve to protect the planet's human population, abiding to their strict code of feudal discipline and ability. Very often they would be the bastions that protected mankind's worlds, and their importance cannot be underestimated at this time. As is often the case in history, it is not one but a series of disasters that leads to total ruination, and this was no exception for the glorious empire humanity had established during the Dark Age of technology. Whilst it was struggling to recover from a collapse in its unity, as well as destruction of many of its resources and its ability to trade efficiently with other worlds, a new disaster would occur that would see the end of humanity's golden age and instead throw us further into near total annihilation. The race of man would never again reach this golden pinnacle of technological achievement. As we learned in ancient Eldar lore, it was at this time that the Eldar out in the galaxy would fall into near total destruction. These would be dark days indeed, as the Eldar were almost wiped out in a cataclysmic annihilation as the chaos god Slaanesh was born into existence from the horrifically depraved mire that Eldar society had fallen into. This was a disaster for the Eldar, nearly extinguishing their light from the universe completely, but it didn't do humanity any favours either. The near destruction of the Eldar and birth of Slaanesh only came to mark the end of the Age of Strife. What caused it prior to these events was the ever-expanding sea of psychic energy known as the Warp. For many millennia, this had been growing more and more powerful, fueled by the nightmarish depravity that was Eldar society. Around the end of Millennium 24 and the beginning of 25, mankind was still struggling to recover from the disastrous war against its Men of Iron and its far-reaching impact on the previously secure and strong human federation. With their galactic unity destroyed, as well as suffering from the inevitable wounds of war, material shortages, mass loss of life and destruction of infrastructure, we would now face a new problem. Warp travel was becoming increasingly difficult. The warp's instability, caused in part by the Eldar's depraved psychic society, meant that many ships now would become lost and consumed by the warp as they were travelling through. This was not an issue for the Eldar themselves, as they used their webways to travel, which were outside of that warp space. For humanity though, it would be a severe problem, and its impact would deal the fatal blow to an already fragile empire. The losses and damage caused by the war with the Men of Iron, combined with now being unable to travel across the warp to cross those great distances in the galaxy, would ultimately return humanity to a pre-Dark Age of technology state, where only sublight travel was possible. This was a disaster. Trade and support could no longer be conducted, as these journeys would now take generations to complete. Humanity was once again isolated as it had been millennia before. The warp storms and the isolation they would create would last for over 5,000 years, and their effect on human society across the galaxy was catastrophic. Some planets with a significantly advanced human colony would survive into the future if they had the means to defend and support themselves. It's important to understand that when a system is set up with no established backup, its collapse has an immediate and profound impact. This was the case with mankind's trade system. It had grown over time to enable many planets to survive solely on imports from other rich parts of the human federation. Without this infrastructure and no way to gain outside support, disaster was inevitable. Many would turn inwardly to the colony, consuming themselves from the inside out, first with barbaric civil war and later total anarchy, fighting over the scarce resources that remained. The final phase often led the significantly depleted population into a feudal system of warlords and barbarism. This chaos was repeated across the majority of human worlds in this period, even including Earth. At this time on Earth, large areas across the planet had become massive cities reaching for hundreds of miles, and having become adapted to a system where all activities were conducted by machines, Earth also now relied heavily on trade from colonized worlds to support the extremely high population count. Additionally, much of the planet was no longer capable of food production and hadn't been for millennia, hence the need for colonies and expansion in the first place. With the inability to travel and trade, Earth descended into a similar fate of the less advanced worlds. First panic and general disorder, then food riots, resource hoarding, and finally complete anarchy. A tribal warlord system was all that remained of the few survivors left on Earth, brutal warriors who battled out across the deserts and hives of the remnants of civilization. This whole situation might sound unbelievable that society could collapse so quickly and to such a severe degree, but it's worth considering that in this time human society had built itself up to be so strong in belief of its own invincibility that they simply did not and could not have anticipated the severity of the warp storms or how they would debilitate the trade and support systems that they had been relying upon. Human history is littered with examples of sheer arrogance outweighing logic and reason, as well as blindly staring down dangerous facts in favour of belief in our own self-importance. The lack of planning when it comes to losing their infrastructure across human systems was an acute example of human arrogance. It would now seem as well that whatever had protected human psyches from demonic possession would now end. It's my speculation that, as previously stated, the Emperor was what provided this shielding, even though he was not known to humanity at this time, for he knew the power, importance and value of human psyches in the dark times that would lie ahead. Without this bubble of protection that had invisibly existed prior to this time, humanity's weak psyches would be consumed, possessed, and go completely insane, causing chaos among isolated, colonized worlds. This period of complete anarchy would last for some 5,000 years, and during this time many colonies would forget their family out in the galaxy, as well as losing vast amounts of technology and knowledge. Only fragments of the glory of humanity would remain, preserved on the advanced worlds who were capable to survive this dark time. By the 28th millennium, almost all traces of civilization on Earth were gone. Instead, techno-barbarians battled one another over the scraps of the ancient human race. Mars, however, was one of the few worlds to undergo a different process. After a brief period of anarchy, the tech priests of the cult Mechanicus emerged victorious over the Psyker mutants and then unified their homeworld. The priests visited Earth, but upon seeing its barren destruction, wrote it off as unsalvageable. They used any titans they had to help them in the future reunification of man. They would also be one of the few worlds to reach out and recolonize planets in this time. Using their knowledge of the warp, they chose moments of calm amid the storms of the time in the warp to travel through and establish new forge worlds. These were replicas of the tech homeworld of Mars and enabled them to continue support and recovery of the technology of man, as well as production of munitions and simpler war machines. But for humanity, its golden age was over. This dark age of technology had fallen apart catastrophically. Many of the weapons that once served mankind brought us to near destruction and turned lush garden worlds into irradiated deserts. Mechanical factory worlds into dystopian nightmares, beautifully advanced and artistic colonies turned into barbaric, nightmarish hells devoid of all morality. The age of strife was upon mankind, and only the further darkness of the future lay ahead. Roughly 5,000 years later, around the period of millennium 30 to 31, human society had reached a state of pitiful decay after cannibalizing itself for millennia. The Eldar had also reached the peak of their social decay, and so heralded the agonizing birth of the Chaos god Slaanesh, who would consume the majority of their population in one cataclysmic event that brought Eldar society to the brink of extinction. This horrific event, though, would have a positive outcome for mankind. It consumed all of that stored turbulent warp energy, so after thousands of years of instability, the warp returned to relative calm. Interstellar communication and travel would once again be possible for the civilization of mankind. So the age of strife was coming to an end, but before we move forward, we need to move back some 2,000 years to M28 to M30. Humanity had now come close to the brink of destruction itself. So many worlds had fallen into disarray, starvation, chaos, anarchy. Now was the time. This would be the time where the mysterious and powerful Psyker who had wandered amongst humanity for thousands of years would come to the fore to lead humanity from an edge of unsalvageable darkness back into the light and resume their place as a meaningful power in the galaxy. Earth had by now been reduced to a chemically irradiated barren wasteland, its population slaughtered, and all that remained were degenerate, feral nomads fighting for irrelevant territories, insane wandering prophets, and cyber-augmented techno-barbarians who lived for nothing other than to fight, created in the cradle of world-ending war. Frail empires would rise and disintegrate as quickly and forgettably as they had risen. No tribal faction had enough power or resources to make any meaningful stand, and so it went on, pathetic fighting over the remnants of a ravaged world. Out of this seemingly endless horror came a single man, a warlord like no other. His title in these early days is unknown, but we would know who he would rise to become. the Emperor of Man. He would first conquer and then rebuild humanity, leading it into the light, saving it from itself to form his autocracy, known as the Imperium of Mankind. Unlike so many before him though, he had power not only as an unstoppable warrior, but in many other traits such as rational thinking, tactics, philosophy, economics, compassion, foresight, and perhaps most importantly, a genius of science, everything and more that would be required for a supreme leader. The Emperor though fought not for selfish personal gain or bloodlust of war like all the other scattered remnants of humanity left on Earth. He had selfless, higher goals to restore humanity spiritually, intellectually and physically, to revert us to a time of strength and prosperity. These were the years of the Unification Wars. The Emperor had long held a facility deep in a range of mountains previously known as the Himalayas. This was his most significant stronghold and would later become the Imperial Palace. Here he experimented with genetics as well as developing and constructing weapons and armour for his warriors. In the earliest days, he would physically and genetically augment some of the most powerful barbarians. These humanoids would become known as the Thunder Warriors. The very first of their kind and the most basic template for what would eventually become the Imperial Space Marines, the Astartes, the greatest warriors in the galaxy. Under unsurmountable pressure from the Emperor's army of Thunder Warriors, the barbaric factions fell quickly and humanity was united on old Earth for the first time in centuries. This, however, would come at a terrible cost for the Thunder Warriors themselves and is one of the least known yet darkest events for mankind. In order to unify Earth and bring humanity back on the path of advancement and strength, the Emperor had found it necessary to in part cleanse the savagery that had grown on the war-torn planet. This sadly meant the death of many arguable innocents during the Unification Wars, as well as the eradication of the last remaining religious church on Earth, known as the Church of the Lightning Stone. The Emperor is known to have personally spoken to the last remaining priest before bringing in his new age of enforced secular rationalism and the ideology known as the Imperial Truth. This essentially tells that humanity are now those destined to be the rulers of the galaxy. The Eldar had their chance and failed, and now humanity are the best set to take their place as the dominant force. This ideology would soon be brought to all the scattered worlds of humanity in the long crusade that was yet to come. Now, the official version of things tells how the last battle of the Unification Wars takes place on Mount Ararat. This siege to cleanse the last of the techno-barbarians from the ruined wastes on Earth and finally bring it back to a time of peace and growth was said to be so brutal that waves of Thunder Warriors fell against the rocks in resistance, were slain to a single man, the legendary warrior Arik Taranis, the Lightning Bearer. He would raise the banner of lightning to mark the end of the Unification Wars, setting in place the rule of the Emperor of Man, before he too would fall to fatal wounds suffered in this battle of legend. As with many things, the official version is not the end of the story. The actuality of the event was darker and far more sinister. The Emperor knew that in order to restore peace, growth and a sense of civilization to his new and expanding empire, he would require a more stable and balanced force than the Thunder Warriors, who were essentially just adept brutes recruited from the wasteland, albeit clad in the earliest Imperial armor. In a necessary betrayal, the Emperor realized that in order to safeguard what he had achieved, his army of barbaric fighters could not exist past this time. It is believed that he actually ordered the many Thunder Warriors who had survived the final battle to be slaughtered by his elite guard, and possibly even some of the early proto-Astartes, who were at this time far advanced beyond most of his standard force. This terrible secret has been concealed from the people of the Imperium for more than 10,000 years, and were it ever to be revealed, the consequences could be unimaginably disastrous. The Emperor, though, saw this necessary evil had to come to pass for the greater good, a sacrifice of the few to save the many who would come. The Thunder Warriors were built for war, and war alone, and would not be able to adapt to a time of peace, and could even have turned a vital tool into a dangerous, unstable threat that could unbalance all that he had achieved. In order for the next stage of his plans, he also required that humanity rally behind him as the sole and most powerful force. The slaughter of the Thunder Warriors was not the last act of betrayal though by the Emperor. He would then take the necessary glory that he had near single-handedly reunified Terra. This distortion of the truth, while hugely distasteful, does appear largely necessary to reunite the whole of humanity and create the most powerful civilization in the galaxy. Nonetheless, should the truth ever arise, it would at best split apart the Imperium and at worst destroy it. These choices by the Emperor are important to remember in the context of his character, as it can lead to certain logical speculations regarding future events. Some Thunder Warriors though would find fate on their side and escape this mass killing and live on as homeless unknowns seeking out a miserable existence at the bottom of society. Honours forgotten, their deeds meaningless, all the while fearing constant discovery from the Imperium and certain death. This heartless betrayal was surely one of the darkest periods in Imperial history. They were never hunted though in any significant way. The Emperor believed them all dead, and besides there were far more important tasks at hand, as the Emperor now gathered a team of gene wrights salvaged from the few remaining humans on Earth. These were men with practical knowledge of genetics to aid in his development of the new Astartes project. Those Thunder Warriors who did escape were not like the Astartes of the 41st millennium. They were genetically unstable, and most significantly, they only had a minimally extended mortality beyond that of a regular human, unlike the Space Marines who can live on for thousands of years. The Emperor had been working for decades on his Astartes project, deep within his mountain facility. Here he would create the vital foundations that would springboard humanity into a new age. His experiments would create the 20 Space Marine legions known as the Legiones Astartes, as well as 20 Primarchs to lead each legion. These 20 supreme leaders of the soon-to-come Space Marine legions were crafted by the Emperor using samples of his own arcane genetic code as the base. It is obviously unknown the depth of which the Emperor used his own DNA to create the Primarchs, but later findings through ancient Imperial records do hint that he spliced multiple DNA types together, even going so far as to introduce some animal DNA into the Primarchs. And this would explain why some, such as Leman Russ, would display the wolf-like qualities, and why these would then become present throughout the Space Wolves Legion and chapter. It is difficult to speculate on the Emperor's true goals here, and even if he was successful in the mixing of DNA in this way, it seems highly experimental, and perhaps he himself was not sure of the final result. This period of intelligent design was hasty and somewhat improvised given the dire situation facing mankind. It needed to repopulate its military power in order to springboard and take stage fights forward to reconquer the colonies. Another point of speculation is how closely the Primarchs were imbued with spiritual elements and others such as unnaturally skillful charisma and so on. Still though, in creating the Primarchs and even taking small elements of the Emperor's DNA, it imbued them with these demi-godlike characteristics. It also explains why at this time the barely known forces of chaos would seek out and scatter the developing Primarchs before the Emperor's plans could grow into fruition. Little is known of this Primarch scattering event, but it has been suggested that the dawning forces of chaos felt this expanding power from humanity to threaten them, and in an effort to slow or negate it, they reached out into the mortal world to seize and scatter the fetal Primarchs across the galaxy. Each world they found themselves on would surely in time come to realise that they were far from normal, often finding themselves as a natural leader in command of the systems that would become their home. Later the Emperor would one by one discover and reunite the Primarchs with their legions, establishing one of the most powerful military forces the galaxy had ever seen. The Thunder Warriors though were undoubtedly the early prototypes for the Astartes project, which subsequently makes their untimely end all the more tragic, as their sacrifice was so great, yet the memory of them was totally obliterated. The Astartes project would continue in a pragmatic manner. Each of the early legions at this time contained barely a few hundred marines. Their equipment was lightweight and somewhat improvised by comparison to later standards. They trained their minds and bodies to be the will, might, and rule of the Emperor. Time would pass and their numbers grew. Each legion was divided not only for organizational reasons but also for practical reasons. Because of their adapted genetics that were drawn from the Primarchs, some carried traits and psychological behaviors which would not have been found comfortable comparison with their sibling legions. This segregation also allowed them to focus their bonds to their brothers in their own legion, creating a near unbreakable kinship between Astartes. If the newly created Astartes would be the Emperor's scalpel, his gleaming pinnacle of human achievement, then the Thunder Warriors were certainly a mace used to bludgeon the remnants of humanity back into submission. The Thunder Warriors were genetically stronger though, tougher, and could even be stronger in battle than the newly created Astartes, which is something people often forget. They were a rough, brutal instrument, but ultimately a temporary solution to a violent problem. The Space Marines would serve not only as a weapon, but as beacons to mankind, a glimmer of what humanity could hope to be. The dark times to come, however, would show that this was a misplaced belief, that while the Space Marines were created to represent the pinnacle of human development, they ultimately proved as susceptible to the basic flaws of mankind as any other mortal. The Emperor's campaign on Earth would now come to a close. He began establishing the fundamental elements of a civilized, modernized society in government administration, economy, and infrastructure. An important figure in this process was a man known as Malcador, the Sigillite. He had a vast knowledge of such matters and carried himself with the bearing of a priest. He was appointed to run the courts and palaces of the new empire, the right-hand man of the Emperor. Earth would turn from a place of desolation and horror to one of active production, rebuilding, and planning. Some might call it coincidentally convenient, but at this time a vast shockwave would travel through the galaxy, the birth of Slaanesh. Humanity would have no idea of the significance of this, only that it cleared the storms from the warp that had isolated and ruined humanity's gloriously technologically advanced empire. Again though, we could speculate that the Emperor had foreseen these events and the necessity of preparing Earth for this time. On Mars, the humans of the cult Mechanicus, that is those who worship machines, would become aware of this unification on Earth, as information through distant communication and physical observations. They viewed this new emperor as a man in alignment with their own agenda. Mars, during the Dark Age of technology, had been a planet with a single purpose, a powerhouse of production for this age, consolidating ships and weapons, including the vast Titans, hundreds of feet tall, gigantic bipedal war machines whose very presence could end conflicts before they began. Since the end of this age, cults had risen across Mars, and the most prevalent of these was the Mechanicus, whose ideology included the veneration and acquisition of these ancient but highly advanced technologies from the period known as the Dark Age of technology. During the period of isolation known as the Age of Strife, Mars had undergone a similar societal collapse comparable to that of Earth. With all trade cut off, they had insufficient water and food to supply the populace. A civil war would follow, as well as the collapse of some planetary infrastructures that shielded their little remaining hydroponics and food production systems. This would lead to a further collapse of the already fragile supporting systems. The Techs, an established Mechanicum, decided the best way to survive this apocalypse would be to retreat into underground bunkers which had been mined out, creating vast cities below the surface. Little is known at this time, but evidently prior to their seclusion, the Mechanicum Techs were a cult who would bear a respect and drive to recover, protect and utilize the lost technologies of mankind. Upon their rise from the subterranean depths, they had in this time translated this over into a complete faith. The tech priests of the Mechanicum, along with their troops, would very quickly subdue the insane irradiated savages who remained on the surface and begin the process of rebuilding and redeveloping Mars to be completely self-sufficient. This, in combination with their access to some of the most powerful war machines ever forged in the galaxy, would without doubt leave the Mechanicus in a position of some power. To the cult of Mechanicus, who were now becoming aware of this emperor figure who had surfaced on Terra, a man of science and technology, this was obviously appealing to the Mechanicus, and some tech priests on Mars even began to suggest that the Emperor was a man of such power as to rival their own machine god and fulfill an ancient prophecy in their faith of techno-mysticism. Debates raged on Mars between the priesthood regarding how to treat this new development. All the while, the Emperor, bearing his power of immense foresight, would not be ignorant of the Mechanicum, and he slowly and steadily would begin to craft his new plans accordingly. Plans for a crusade on a galactic scale never before seen. Its purpose? To locate the lost Primarchs, to reunite the territories of humanity, forge a new Imperial Empire, and thrust the Imperium of Man into a position of complete dominance and power throughout the galaxy. The Emperor's plan was one of absolute submission. Anyone who stood against the Imperial truth would be cleansed and destroyed. The Mechanicum of Mars were one of the few exceptions. The Emperor knew that any battle to try and claim dominance over the cult Mechanicum would be hugely counterproductive. Even if he could claim victory over them, the cost to his new Astartes force would be severe and unjustified. So he planned instead to offer a rare alliance with the Council of Tech Priests. In offering them assistance in their own goals and acquisitions of new and lost tech throughout the galaxy, they would provide support, construction of war gear and tech to Imperial forces. They also were one of the exceptional entities to be allowed to maintain a state of semi-independence within the Imperium, a fairly unique position. The Emperor would also provide a new group of navigators to enable the Mechanicum to travel through the warp again in search of fabled STC units. All of this suited the Mechanicum and Imperium in a symbiotic relationship, and an alliance was created. And so we reach the beginning of Millennium 31. With Mars now allied to the Emperor's Imperium, the Legiones Astartes war machine had significantly expanded. The Mechanicum would provide the battle barges needed to transport the Space Marines throughout the galaxy. They also brought to the table the Titans, some of the most powerful war machines ever created. Their very presence on approaching a humanoid system would often be enough to prevent a conflict. The shock and awe of facing such incomprehensible opponents would quickly lead a populace to understand they had no hope of preventing the Imperial Expeditionary Forces from achieving their goals. The crusade would initially be led by the Emperor himself as he commanded a massive fleet of Astartes. As the crusade gathered pace and the Primarchs were recovered, these expeditionary fleets would number in the thousands. Before we talk about the crusade itself though, which I have tried to condense as much as possible, I want to first talk briefly on the Astartes or Space Marines. Now, a regular misconception about Space Marines is that because they wear near identical armour and were originally produced via a variation of cloning, or at least grown in a lab, that they somehow have no personality or little differentiation between them. It is also often assumed that Space Marines will blindly follow any commands given to the letter, no matter the consequences. After all, they are the superior, unquestioning warriors in the universe, right? Both of these myths is fundamentally wrong. Each Space Marine is an individual person with their own character, traits, to an extent personal principles. There are many documented events in which these human elements would have a role to play in subsequent events. Space Marines, although superhuman, are still human, and as such the Emperor deemed it necessary to have a senior position with whom Astartes could use as a point of reference to discuss matters of morality, to understand their purpose, their mission, and sometimes to give guidance beyond purely military matters during the Crusade and the expeditionary forces. Enter the Iterators. Imperial Iterators were the most persuasive of public speakers. They are masters of manipulating a crowd's opinion, and Iterators would counsel also Marines as they voyaged through the galaxy. But their role went beyond this and was critical at the inception of the Great Crusade. They were placed among the expeditionary forces to aid in reuniting humanity and turning lost human civilizations to the Imperial cause. The Emperor appointed them to spread the Imperial truth. Truths such as the rejection of religious faith to enforce secular rule, and unnecessary wasteful squabbling over power and resources. These were all seen as significantly counterproductive and opposite to the objectives of the Imperium. The first Primarch to be reunited with the Imperial fleet was Horus of the Lunar Wolves. He greatly admired the Iterators' work, so much so that he asked them to also tutor his captains and legionnaires. Horus believed that once the crusade was completed, there would be an end to the war, and that the Astartes would first need to find a peacetime vocation. The most famous Iterator during the Great Crusade was Primary Iterator Kyril Sindaman, who served aboard Horus's flagship. Iterators are seen as the precursors to Imperial Guard commissars and Astartes chaplains. The Iterators and then later the chaplains are an example of the more human services required by Space Marines. Documented records have shown that they have been regularly known to question ethics, purpose, and even their own morality, despite an Astartes essentially being immortal. They are destined to die in battle, as that is their true purpose. And despite this predefined fate, they are far from the emotionless drones that some would assume. They are a living embodiment of humanity, a distillation of spirit and mind. The Emperor's Great Crusade to reunify humanity had begun in earnest. This was an operation on a truly epic scale. Millions of troops, tens of thousands of ships forged by the Mars Mechanicum. This would be humanity's defining moment, to reach out and forge the greatest empire in the galaxy. The Imperial forces comprised soldiers, naval officers, and most importantly, the Astartes legions. They were configured and divided into expeditionary fleets supported by all manner of cruisers, transports, scout teams, dropships, and so on. Commanded by the Emperor and his war council, but also by individuals placed in charge of these expeditionary forces. It's important to remember that these forces were as much exploratory as they were tasked with an important mission. A great deal of time had passed during the Age of Strife, as well as incalculable quantities of data had been lost in the process. The Imperial forces simply didn't know exactly where all the colonies were, nor their status. Had they been destroyed in civil war, alien genocide, or perhaps the opposite and expanded to a degree where they would not need aid but instead submission? All of these were unknowns. Many locations could be estimated as to whether or not they had been colonized in the past. The Mechanicum could provide some information from past scripture as to where human colonies had been located, although more importantly, they wanted to know where we could find ancient and undiscovered technology. The expeditionary fleet would even initiate a search on the basis of myths and rumour. No stone was to be left unturned in the search for the lost civilizations of mankind. Before they embarked on their journey though, one other important task was required. Although the warp storms had subsided, allowing travel once again across great distances, the navigator class from the past that would guide ships through the warp. This system though was far from perfect, and the Emperor had a greater plan. On Earth, the Emperor ordered construction of the Great Astronomicon. Tech priests from Mars were drafted in to aid in this project, and its purpose would be to enable the Emperor to guide, oversee, and command his vast fleet all from Terra. It created a system for him to focus, amplify, and broadcast psychic signals and energy. It would stand as an unchanging marker, a lighthouse for the navigators, a point of reference around which they could plan all their travels. This certainly was an important factor in the success of the Crusade, as it enabled the navigators to travel through the warp in great leaps and faster than they ever had done before. In addition to this, the Emperor would also create the Astropaths. These were powerful psychers whose sole task would be in relaying communications from the fleet and later the established Imperium back to the ruling council on Terra. The vast distances involved meant that the Astropaths would become the only communication link between Terra and the distant colonies. However, as with the Eldar, the risk of possession to the Astropaths by warp demons consuming the psychers and thereby enabling them to travel into the material world was one that the Emperor was all too aware of, especially after his Primarchs had been scattered throughout the galaxy. To this end, the Astropaths would undergo an extreme and harsh process of toughening against the threat of warp entities. The Emperor himself would manipulate and reform their mind into a protective vessel, making them nearly immune to risks from the warp. This process, though, was agonizing and extremely dangerous. Many psykers were killed in the process or went completely insane. Even if they survived the process, a universal effect would see their optic nerves become damaged beyond repair. This meant all astropaths are blind. From the Imperial perspective though, this was a necessary consequence as they continued to be an integral part of Imperial infrastructure. The Crusades had begun, and alongside Space Marines were hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Imperial troops, humans who were salvaged from the aftermath of terror and structured into an effective, albeit expendable fighting force. This Imperial Guard was strengthened and resupplied as they reconnected and conquered lost human colonies. A secondary benefit was that in drafting local military forces into the expeditionary force, it removed these planets' ability to rebel effectively against the newly created Imperial outposts on each planet. Also, in these early days, taxes and tribute to the Imperium were not strictly required, but Imperial commanders stationed on new colonies of the Imperium would often require supplies for the continuing crusade. Many systems and colonies would need help rebuilding or periods after generations of schooling by iterators to bring them in line and around to the Imperial truth and loyalty to the Imperium. Some worlds though who were self-sufficient had survived intact and would even welcome the arriving Imperial forces with open arms as long-awaited brothers, with glorious celebrations and immediate support, much to the satisfaction and pride of the expeditionary forces who were all too happy to welcome their brothers back to the Imperium. Such events were a blessing to behold though, as many worlds were either barren wastes long since destroyed, with only ruined remains to prove that anyone had ever existed there. Or they were found to be locked in brutally tyrannical dictatorships and required sometimes days, often weeks of orbital and ground assault to subdue and conquer these false dictators. Religious doctrine and faith were especially highlighted to be crushed on all worlds. The Emperor would never allow these practices to infringe or threaten the Imperium, as he was partly responsible and had even seen the effects these caused on humanity millennia ago in the first age of mankind. The Emperor also made an important choice that upon arrival to new worlds, any psykers discovered were told to expect transport back to Terra, courtesy of secretive black ships. Here, they would be tested on their journey back to Earth to their limit. They would endure nightmarish examination, some dying from the trials or executed for being just too unstable. Others, though, ended up completely losing their minds in the process of these harsh examinations. The fate of these individuals was at the time unknown. It later transpired that if they were proven strong and capable enough in manipulating their psychic power, they would become stock for creating new astropaths by the Emperor. Any younger but highly powerful psykers were subsequently distributed to some of the Space Marine legions who had begun a Librarius program, creating special Astartes who were capable of wielding immense psychic power. Others, though, disappeared from record entirely, leading to supposition of secret organizations who even today are not fully disclosed. The Crusade continued for centuries, stretching out across the galaxy. Finally, the Primarchs were reunited with their legions and were duly given positions on the Crusade and Imperial War Council. The Primarch figures, though, were not suited to this level of administration. They were at their best out among their Marines leading campaigns. So it fell to the administrators of Man to run the day-to-day Crusade infrastructure. One important figure arises again, that of Malcador the Sigillite. He would become a keystone in the execution of the Crusade and one of the most loyal and valuable members of the Imperial Council. The power of the Imperium had now reached its peak. There seemed to be little, if anything, that could threaten, damage or destabilize the glory and power of the now reunited Imperium of Man. The Crusade had in fact been so successful that after a chain of impressive victories, the Emperor decided he could fully return to Terra to continue managing his plans there and working on new secret projects. His Primarchs were surely more than capable of finishing the now simple task of scouting and securing any fringe colonies and bringing the Crusade to a successful conclusion. After a specifically great victory on Ulanor, the Emperor selected the first Primarch and commander of the Lunar Wolves, known as Horus Lupercal, and bestowed upon him the title of War Master. This title established him as a leader of the Imperial military forces in lieu of the Emperor, and all other Primarchs and Imperial forces would follow the War Master's commands as if they were the Emperor's. Not all the other Primarchs seemed to be entirely comfortable, not only with this decision, but also with the Emperor's choice to leave them and return to Terra. Considering their strength of character, this seems somewhat surprising, but if anything it shows that their bond they shared with the Emperor was perhaps not rock solid, and some of them felt bewildered he should choose to leave them on the fringes of the galaxy when overall victory seems so near and so secure. Horus, whilst being a supreme master of military matters, was also less well known for being exceptionally tactful and charismatic. He would take time to speak to each of his brother Primarchs in turn. Understanding them as he did, he would employ his various skills of perception and charisma to appeal to their individual natures and reassure them that although the Emperor had granted him this glorious honour, it was the Brotherhood together who would achieve the ultimate victory. This helped quell some of the disquiet, but it was not only the Primarchs who felt bemused that the Emperor had abandoned them, and in time, this in combination with other unfortunate events would lead to the darkest of catastrophes. In fact, there have been many examples throughout human history where withholding information would lead to disaster, and this period for humanity would be no exception. The Emperor's decision to not make his Space Marines aware of the dark forces of chaos for their own benefit. In fact, even to this day, the vast majority of the Imperial citizenship lives blissfully unaware of the darkness that lies in the Immaterium. The Emperor's precise reasons for this are not crystal clear. Perhaps he felt that humans were too easily persuaded or tempted by the promises of quick, easy power. But whatever the reason, the consequences for the Primarchs and Space Marines to not be able to see this danger, as well as the Imperium, would be disastrous. The Astartes legions had encountered vague clues and shrouded warnings on some lost human worlds they encountered, whispers in the wind, apparent possession of Marines. Horus and his Lunar Wolves discovered direct evidence of some dark force when they encountered a lost but highly advanced human colony known as the Interrex in the later stages of the Expeditionary Crusade. As the fleet travelled to the Interrex homeworld, they engaged in extended peaceful negotiations. Again, this was an example of the Space Marines and notably Horus not giving preference to immediate combat, but in choosing a peaceful option. If this was viable to them, it was always preferable. Their mission of Imperial Truth was without question. It was the only resolution that would ever be acceptable to the fleet though. Now during this encounter, Garviel Loken, who was the Lunar Wolves' 10th captain and a member of the Mournival. The Mournival was a close and under Imperial rule illegal clique of brothers, but one which Horus had allowed to exist so as to help advise him on matters of importance. Loken was among the Warmaster's party when they attended a reception with these Interrex during negotiations. He was drawn into a casual conversation with one of the Interrex guard, who admitted that the Interrex had learned to tread carefully with any newcomers to their people because they feared the taint of chaos with a K on these newcomers. It becomes apparent that the Interrex colony had made dealings with the Xenos race, the Eldar, during the Age of Strife, and the Interrex explain how it is their understanding from what they could discern from the Eldar that chaos is a threat like no other, that it would not appear brutal or blunt at first, but subtly. They feared chaos deceptively approaching their space, posing as a friend, seeking to bleed its way into their confidences and then destroy them mercilessly from the inside out. Loken was shaken at these unknown revelations, and the Warmaster Horus would later assure him that there is no fundamental evil in the galaxy, and that is the end of the matter. But the seeds of suspicion are planted. Loken cannot shake this feeling that something, somewhere, is wrong. But before he'd have any opportunity to follow up and explore these doubts, a break-in occurs in one of the Interrex's most sacred museums, and a highly advanced blade known as an anatheme is stolen. At this time, despite Horus's pleas for restraint, negotiations would now collapse, and the Lunar Wolves and the advanced Interrex would fall into all-out conflict. The Space Marines of Horus are ultimately victorious over the Interrex, but it's a victory Horus takes no pleasure in, as it's born out of misunderstanding and was a tragic, unnecessary conflict. These events, though, would become just a singular fragment in a deteriorating pattern of troubles that would haunt and gesticulate within Horus, as well as his unease then irradiating out into his brother Primarchs, the Mournival, his and other legions. Unbeknownst to Horus, a sequence of events had been now initiated, and their cascade could not be prevented. So why are these events so important? Well, for one, it gives more insight into the fact that at the time it seems barely any Space Marines at any level of rank had any knowledge of chaos. And if they did, it was only the vaguest of suspicions, the kind that could easily be brushed off by speaking to, say, some iterators. They had no idea about the true nature or capabilities of the malevolent force known as Chaos. By comparison, the Emperor understood all too well the dark forces that had very recently annihilated the Eldar and consumed so many human colonies throughout the Age of Strife. It seems strange that he would choose not to gift his Astartes, and more importantly his Primarchs, with this information so that they could best protect against its darkness. But perhaps he feared that knowledge of the warp entities would do more harm than good, instead choosing ignorance as the best policy. However, a combination of time, doubt, rejection, jealousy, and greed brewing in corners of the Astartes legions would prove this to be an unwise decision. The 31st millennium of man would be one of the darkest and most destructive humanity had faced. It would bring the newly established Imperium to its knees and deal wounds so severe it would never truly recover. I need to say that this section of Imperial lore is vastly complex and heavily documented. Bearing that in mind, I'll be covering it in a briefer fashion as specific events can be looked at later in time. However, the 31st millennium is one of the most important periods as it deals with the fall of humanity as a truly dominant power and the inception of the Imperium that would exist into the 41st millennium. The Horus Heresy. This was essentially a mutiny by several Primarchs and their Space Marine legions, a betrayal against the Emperor and the Imperium instigated by the War Master Horus Lupercal. Now, considering how much is written about these events, it actually takes place over a very short timescale in the general scheme of events in 40k, lasting for only about 7 years. As I already outlined, this rebellion ultimately was orchestrated by, at this time, the unknown forces of chaos. Yet there were many secondary factors, and arguably, even without the influence of chaos, it seems possible that these events could have taken place without dark suggestions from the warp, albeit likely to a lesser extent. The Emperor's return to Terra to establish new projects that, for whatever reason, he was unwilling to also share with even Horus or any of the Primarchs, left them feeling set aside and cast out from his circle of trust. This would lead to feelings of resent or in some outright anger and disgust. This was less though about ego or pride than it was trust, although there is no doubt these emotions were an element in play. Primarchs, despite their demigod-like stature and ability, were fundamentally human at the core. It was more about their deep connection to the Emperor, and perhaps that they saw themselves not as equal, but at least on a similar level to him. His retreat to Earth and abandonment of them at this juncture certainly left them feeling consigned to the rest of humanity. These feelings were surely only fragments of doubt, not an outright stab to the heart, but nonetheless the seeds of mistrust were sown, and those chinks in the armour of the Imperium were exactly what the dark warp entities of chaos looked for. Another factor in the resentment and frustration felt by the Primarchs and some higher officers in Space Marine legions would be the Council of Terror. This was a governing body charged with the administration and infrastructure control of the Crusade and Imperium as a whole. It was controversial among the Astartes as it comprised an all-human council. Primarchs and Space Marines alike were not given permission to sit with the Terror Council. Their role was for that of war, and all military matters were handled by the War Master. One of the most primary council members was the previously mentioned Malcador the Sigillite. Malcador was no simple man though. He was a psyker of immense power and used these abilities to reach out into the vast realms of space. He was a close aide to the Emperor during Earth's unification wars and is said to have formed the Administratum of Terror. So he is no mere administrator, but a vastly important figure, as important in fact as any Primarch. Some of the Emperor's sons though did not feel that the Imperium should be run by human bureaucrats, and so the Council of Terror would become another chip on the shoulder and a contributing factor to heresy. One last and specific act though would turn at least one Primarch away from the Emperor and continue to raise doubts in others: the disciplining of Lorgar. Lorgar was the Primarch of the Word-Bearers, or as they often referred to themselves, the Bearers of the Word. The word referred to is the Emperor's word. However, the Word-Bearers were almost fundamentalist in their beliefs. Lorgar believed with every fibre of him that the Emperor himself was a divine being, one true god of mankind. They believed this to the core and preached it across their homeworld as well as any they encountered during the expeditionary crusades. But the Emperor had long since outlawed any concept of belief and religion, imposing a strictly secular rule of law in the Imperial Truth to create a constructively rationalist society. For the longest time though, these religious emanations were suspected and tolerated by the Imperial Council, and even to an extent by the Emperor. Eventually, however, the Word-Bearers came under closer scrutiny by the simple fact that by comparison to other legions they were unbearably slow with their conquest rate during the Crusade. An investigation fleet was sent by the Imperial Council to establish what was causing this slow progress. On arrival at some of the conquered worlds of the Word-Bearers, they found their answer. To the fleet commander's horror, they had discovered that the Word-Bearers had been spending years indoctrinating and converting the worlds to the illegal and false faith of the Imperium. This was a tediously slow process and took significantly longer than usual conquests, as was often so bloody due to the worlds initially resisting having an enforced faith. This egregious practice was considered an abject failure of duty by the Imperium and the Emperor himself. Worse still, it came to light that the word-bearers had been employing a standard practice to execute those who did not renounce their faith and accept that of the Imperium and Emperor as the divine faith, which only served to pour more fuel onto the flames of outrage. The Emperor was absolutely enraged by this notion that he should be worshipped as a god, and the actions of the word-bearers in his name, slaughtering those who refused to accept the Emperor's divinity, stank of the religious excesses that had so often poisoned human history, and the Emperor had witnessed firsthand throughout the ages. So the word-bearers had not only broken his principal rules, but also wasted vast amounts of time and resources. All the worlds they had brought into the Imperium had to be purged in an extremely traumatic process, wasting more lives and more resources. To balance these incomprehensible actions, the Emperor would publicly humiliate Lorgar. To publicly reprimand a Primarch in front of his Space Marines and even present humans was an unprecedented act, and it cut Lorgar to the core. In one encounter, his faith was publicly ripped from him by the Emperor, and all the worlds they had conquered were to be purged. Lorgar was beside himself, as were all the word-bearers, to not only have their faith burned away, but to also know that all their years of efforts counted for naught was an unbearable burden to carry. It is said that the Emperor did not want to break and ruin the word-bearers or Lorgar. He was not vindictive in that way. He wanted to merely set them back on the path to being an effective force for the Imperium and mankind. To cure this corruption, the Emperor turned to the glorious Ultramarines and Robert Guilliman, known for his exceptional tact and unflinching loyalty to the Emperor. The Ultramarines were the word-bearers' mirror and shadow alike in so many ways and different in so many others. A living example of what the word-bearers had the potential to be. The Emperor ordered a task force comprised of Ultramarines, his elite personal bodyguards, and the Imperial Council Regent Malcador the Sigillite. Their mission? To raise the capital city of the planet Kur to the ground. A planet of high importance to the word-bearers, who considered its capital, Monarchia, the perfect city because of the citizens' intense religious devotion and the sheer number of cathedrals and monuments dedicated to the worship of the Emperor as the god of humanity. Following a temporary mass evacuation of bewildered human citizens who could not understand what crime they had committed, sent out distress signals to the word-bearers, who they considered to be angels. The Ultramarines, though, continued their mission and engaged in the orbital destruction of Monarchia. The Word-Bearers Legion arrived to answer the distress calls of the planet, only to find to their utter confusion the Ultramarines in orbit. The Word-Bearers were ordered to assemble planet-side. 100,000 Marines were ordered within sight of the smouldering raised ruins of Monarchia, where the Emperor himself stood. The word-bearers were forced, along with all others in attendance, including Lorgar, to kneel before him in the ashes of the city, which stood for all they had believed and done in the name of the Emperor and the Imperium. He explained to them in no uncertain terms that they had failed in duty, that their efforts had been futile, and wasted beliefs were an abhorrence. He was no god, no angel, no divine being, but a man. No such belief would be permitted in his Imperium. The Emperor departed, leaving a Primarch humiliated and a legion humbled. Lorgar was physically and psychologically numbed by the Emperor's actions. The razing of the city of Monarchia was a trauma almost too great for many of the word-bearers to cope with, and had it not been for their strength of genetics, they would have likely been mass suicides and insanity. Lorgar himself, though, fell into a deep melancholy that would burn harder and brighter within him as days turned to weeks, turned to months. Why is this sequence of events so important? In the future years of the Imperium, it was said that all that would later come to pass was born in this microcosm, that the mission and humiliation carried out here would be recalled as the catalyst of a galactic civil war. The ruination of the word-bearers is critical in understanding the next sequence of events. They were left reeling from the events on Kur, as well as the ritual humiliation and destruction of the Legion's faith. The fate of the word-bearers at this time is sketchy due to the destructive nature of this period and the events to follow, but it is known that they disappeared for a time, seemingly lost in a whirlwind of confusion, disillusionment, and even rage. The Emperor's hope that they would be set straight on the path of the imperial truth was flawed, and their resentment hugely underestimated. Instead, they withdrew, wandering the galaxy, seeking, waiting for a light of clarity to guide them. It seems likely that Lorgar's fall began after Monarchia, that the dark powers of the warp reached out to him in his despair and offered him that which the Emperor had denied him, a divine power to believe in. It is not known whom these voices that counselled him were. It's possible, but entirely speculative, that as with Horus later, some of his closest officers such as Erebus, the word-bearer's first chaplain, would be the first to be corrupted and then begin the spread of darkness. What is certain though is that when the word-bearers reappeared to rejoin the Great Imperial Crusade, they appeared to be refocused as the Emperor had hoped. But this was far from the truth. The word-bearers now no longer served the Emperor or humanity, and were the very first Space Marine Legion to fall to the darkness of chaos. The war between humanity and chaos would still not come until more of the Emperor's crusading forces had been seeded with dark betrayal. Horus Lupercal, favourite of the Emperor, War Master of the Crusade, would become the apex of these events. The real treachery would begin on a small planet named Davin. This world had been easily absorbed into the Imperium by Horus and his legion, the Lunar Wolves, some 60 years previously. The warrior people living there quickly realised they were outclassed and bowed to the powers of the Imperium. Horus was impressed with their realism, honour and strength. Spending time there, the Lunar Wolves brought away from Davin the concept of the Warrior Lodge, a close clique of senior brothers who would share their knowledge and opinions evenly, without rank obstruction. The concept of lodges, guilds or clans within a legion or imperial force was strictly outlawed by the Emperor as something which could brew dangerous opinions and dissent, as evidently turned out to be the case. Horus decided that he knew better. Now Erebus, the aforementioned first chaplain of the word-bearers, was at this point fully corrupted by chaos. He reported to the Lunar Wolves that Commander Temba, the governor of Davin, and his forces had turned renegade and dug themselves into a fortress on Davin's moon. Horus led an assault force to clear the moon and extract Temba personally. On the surface, his forces were confronted by the foul, reanimated remains of Temba's outpost, who had evidently succumbed to the chaos plague of Nurgle's rot, skewing them into horrific parodies of the human form. Horus slew the grossly altered Temba personally, but not before Temba managed to strike a blow to Horus using the advanced blade, the Anatheme. The Anatheme, you will recall, was the highly advanced blade stolen decades previous by Erebus from the people known as the Interrex. The weapons appeared to be semi-sentient, as the Interrex claimed the weapons could be instructed to recognise a particular person, which gave them the ability to mortally wound that person. The Interrex did not know how to produce these weapons, but had confiscated them from a Xenos race known as the Kinebrak. It seems clear that Erebus orchestrated the whole sequence of events on Davin's moon, and potentially worse, had already been corrupted by chaos even prior to his theft of the Anatheme from the Interrex years before. The distorted, chaos-riddled Temba had been instructed to speak Horus Lupercal's name to the blade. This meant that upon striking the greatest Primarch of the Imperium, it would wound him in such a way as to be beyond even his demi-godlike powers of healing. The fate of the Anatheme would still have importance in the years to come. Horus was taken back to his ship, the Vengeful Spirit, where apothecaries frustratingly determined his wound could not be healed naturally or otherwise. Horus's Mournival, his lodge of closest officers, took him in their despair to the Serpent Lodge on Davin, where Erebus assured them he knew how to heal the War Master in a special spiritual ceremony. This was, of course, all part of Erebus's plan. During this ritual, Horus's spirit would be transferred into the warp along with Erebus, disguised as one of the War Master's closest friends, Hastur Sejanus, captain of the 4th Company. This out-of-body experience showed Horus a terrifying vision of the future, which unbeknownst to him were caused by his very actions, bringing the Imperium into an age of repressive, violent and superstitious regime where the Emperor and some of the most loyal Primarchs were worshipped as divine beings by the fanatical and ignorant masses of humanity. The Chaos Gods portrayed themselves as the victims of the Emperor's psychic might, who had been suppressed throughout the ages and had no interest themselves in controlling the material world. Horus, already having grown jealous and deeply resentful of the perceived poor treatment at the hands of the Emperor, and was one of many of the Astartes legions afraid of the concept of a peace wherein all for which they had fought would be turned over to weak-willed mortal men, whilst his legions were cast aside and left as peacekeepers without a purpose. These were the Emperor's wishes. For you see, the Astartes were always a tool to save humanity and bring power back to mankind, not just to subjugate it. Horus, in his weakened and embittered state, was very suggestible and would accept this twisted and misunderstood prophecy. But there was one thing Erebus had not counted on. Horus's brother, Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons, a legion and chapter who had widely embraced psychers and their unique powers, had continued to study the forbidden arts of warp manipulation and sorcerous powers. The Cyclopean giant of Magnus appeared within Horus's vision, revealing Erebus's true identity and begging Horus not to fall in to the temptations of chaos. It was all in vain though. Horus had by now already decided that if anyone deserved to be worshipped as a god, then it was he. The godlike warp demons of chaos healed Horus's wounds and between them made a deal. In exchange for the immense power he would gain, as well as ruling power over the mortal galaxy, he would deliver to them the Emperor, who the dark chaos gods feared most, as they knew he alone stood with enough power to potentially destroy them. Although Horus had always been an immensely skillful military leader, his true genius was in the manipulation of others. This was often remarked upon by his brother Primarchs, Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists once noting to Garviel Loken, who you remember was the Lunar Wolves captain and a member of the Mournival, that Horus had Loken put forward a campaign of war so his character would be more well known as a peacemaker than a warmonger. Dawn said, "You understand what Horus had you do this morning? He had primed the Mournival to back him, Loken. He is cultivating the air of a peacemaker, for that plays well across the worlds of the Imperium. This morning he wanted someone other than himself to suggest unleashing the legions for war." This skill of manipulation would be especially important now. It was one thing for the Chaos Aberrations to turn a few men and even a Primarch, but to turn legions and still more Primarchs, the strongest willed and most loyal of the Emperor's forces to Chaos? How would this be possible? Well, it would in part because Horus did not declare himself outright as a disciple of Chaos, nor would he follow immediately the darkest of their practices. As had been the case until now, the game being played was one of subtlety and deception. Horus began implementing throughout the legions the concept of the Mournival, that he had allowed first within the Lunar Wolves. The Mournival Lodge enabled officers to group together in secret and lay the seeds of discontent and mutiny. Horus would also capitalize on the current negative feelings among some of his fellow Primarchs, and then the refracted disillusionment among some of the legions. Lorgar and the Word Bearers had already turned to Chaos following their world-shattering humiliation by the Emperor. Horus would engage legions of Astartes, Imperial troops, and even several Mars Titan legions with the principal concept that Horus now perceived the Emperor, powerful as he was, did not deserve the unreserved praise and recognition of the human race. More Astartes legions would now join the traitors, Angron and the World Eaters, Mortarion and his Death Guard, Fulgrim and the Emperor's children were among the first to side with the War Master. others would later fall, including the Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and lastly, the Thousand Sons. It had become clear that the Primarchs were far from the perfect demigod-like human form they were perceived to be. Although technically each Primarch was physically and mentally godlike compared to a standard human, they still bore all of humanity's virtues as well as their flaws such as ego, greed, envy, arrogance, rage, and more besides. These superhuman warriors were meant to be the saviors of mankind, but instead they could be the downfall of everything that had been salvaged and achieved. The Thousand Sons Legion would be a particularly tragic story. Their Primarch Magnus the Red, who you remember had attempted to prevent Horus from falling to darkness whilst experiencing his out-of-body experience to the warp on Davin. Magnus and the Thousand Sons Legion had begun to use psychic powers and warp sorcery as part of their legion's general practices. This was actually outlawed by the Emperor, who was cautious of using psychic power in only controlled services. It's surprising they chose this path to break with Imperial law. However, it seems that they actually bore a natural affinity for such practices, and as with many things, likely started out small before becoming more widespread. In time, many Space Marine legions and chapters would use sanctioned psychers in the new librarian branch of the forces, but in these early days there was no regulation or established command. As a consequence, many of the Thousand Sons Marines would suffer whole body deterioration, as they would eventually become consumed by the warp powers, unable to control or prevent this. It was for this reason that Magnus the Red was able to travel into the warp and see Horus in his most dire of situations. Magnus, after this incident, was so grief-stricken that rather than physically travel to Earth and speak to the Emperor, which now in hindsight would have been the far better choice, he chose to use his psychic power to reach out and speak to the Emperor himself at the Imperial Palace on Terra. But this would shatter all the psychic wards the Emperor had placed on the palace and severely damage the project being secretly worked on by the Emperor. This itself was connected to the psychic paths of the webway, the gateways used by the Eldar, and previously the Old Ones. This choice by Magnus was catastrophic and a rash miscalculation. His psychic assault on the Imperial Palace, his panic and frustration and anger and trauma gave free rein to the warp and its evil inhabitants to invade Terra. Millions of psychers died instantly as their attuned minds were burned out or demons tore them apart. Warp storms consumed entire settlements, shockwaves flattened structures around the world. Having strictly outlawed Magnus's use of sorcery and refusing to believe that Horus, his most trusted son, would betray him, the Emperor concluded wrongly for the traitor to be Magnus and the Thousand Sons. This error would be yet another travesty of judgment among the many during this whole sorry period. The Emperor ordered Leman Russ and his Space Wolves to engage and destroy Magnus and the Thousand Sons. But Magnus, now defeated physically and mentally, cast out by his father, they were turned away from the Imperium and into traps to entice them into the darkness of chaos. Horus was all too aware that there were some Primarchs and Legions too loyalist to ever be persuaded away from the Imperium, such as the Imperial Fists, Ultramarines, Blood and Dark Angels. Horus would instead send these legions far away to the far reaches of the Empire on missions designed to keep them busy, while the traitors would descend on Earth to destroy the Imperium and most critically the Emperor himself. As we outlined earlier, there would now take place many events which would lead some further astray and for the Emperor to become more aware that something was extremely wrong in the Imperium. These can be covered in more detail later. Magnus of the Thousand Sons was for the Emperor, as far as he was aware, a lone corruptor, distorted by his unlicensed use of the warp. This, of course, was sadly the extreme opposite of the actual situation, but the extreme destruction and loss of life on Earth after it had been contained, as well as the damage to the Emperor's ongoing Gateway project, would be enough to cloud his judgment. Horus, though, would now move up to expand upon the early seeds of betrayal in the following campaigns of the Isstvan system. Horus would order the virus bombing of Isstvan III, a planet that had declared itself separate from the Imperium. Many loyalist marines from traitor legions were actually planetside when Horus and the orbital navy performed exterminatus on the planet, killing all 12 billion inhabitants, including the space marines from multiple legions. Horus watched from orbit, declaring, "Let the galaxy burn." The virus bombs laid waste to the planet, devouring any organic material they encountered, disintegrating humans and seeping into the suits and armour of any Astartes. The storms of the virus raged until the planet was nothing more than a barren desert. The few remaining loyalist space marines would eventually be butchered by their brothers until Horus ordered an orbital bombardment until nothing remained alive on the surface of Isstvan III. Enter Captain Garrow of the 7th Company Death Guard Legion. Nathaniel Garrow is one of my favourite heroes of the Horus Heresy and perhaps all of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, namely because he was fundamentally responsible for saving the Imperium. His unwavering loyalty and strength of character, which apparently went beyond even some of the Primarchs. He is also a legendary character of the age because of what he would become later after the period of heresy, but again that is another story. Garrow bore witness to the massacre on Isstvan III and was quick to understand the real horror not only of this specific event but what was happening at large. Realising that he would have to escape not only the fleet of the War Master, the sons of Horus, previously the Lunar Wolves, and the Emperor's children, but also his own legion, they would make a warp jump aboard an old fleet ship, the Eisenstein. Without having time to chart its route or destination, this left them then marooned, as well as being subject to multiple attacks from the warp by the dark forces of chaos and the specific deity Nurgle, who had corrupted and mutated his own Death Guard legion. Despite all this, they survived and proceeded to detonate their ship's core in the vain hope of attracting a ship to come and rescue them. Luckily for the crew, they succeeded, and the vessel approaching turned out to be an Imperial Fists Astartes barge containing none other than the Primarch Rogol Dorn himself. Trying to convince Dorn of Horus and the other legion's betrayal, though, was a near impossible task. The suggestion sent him into such a fit of rage he nearly executed Garrow on the spot and would have been doomed to failure were it not for the Remembrancers. The Remembrancers were an order of historians, journalists and civilians from Earth at the time who were sent along with the expeditionary fleets of the Great Crusade. Their function was to chronicle deeds, events and generally record the history so that we could then hold that for the future Imperium of Man. Remembrancers were generally seen as very reliable sources of information, especially those who had any psychic capabilities, if they were psychers, and could actually record information simply by visualizing that, by seeing it. And when Rogol Dorn could actually see the events that had unfolded, he had no choice but to accept them. Returning to Terra, Dorn would speak to the Emperor, and finally the betrayal and heresy would come into the light. Garrow, though, in immense frustration despite all his efforts, was not able to speak to the Emperor himself, but was stationed on the lunar colony along with the remaining loyalist Death Guard and Imperial Navy crew of the Eisenstein. The Imperial forces on Earth considered their presence too dangerous to allow them to roam freely. Horus Lupercal had now extinguished the last shreds of loyalty from the 3 legions under his command, who were now complete in their misguided transition to chaos. His next target in the campaign was Isstvan V. Here, he would establish a command post and reinforce his position. The Emperor, now in a fit of despair and rage at the actions of Horus, commanded 7 legions of Astartes to attack and subdue the traitors, and subsequently return them to Terra to face their actions. However, unbeknownst to the Emperor, at least half of these legions had already been deceived and strayed from loyalty to the Imperium. They had not yet made their stance clear, but represented a dangerous deception to the Imperium. The first wave of attacks to Isstvan V were carried out by the Loyalist legions, the Salamanders, the Raven Guard and the Iron Hands. Horus had already been passed information of their landing sites, and this would cost them horrific losses at this initial contact. Worse would come though. The 4 remaining legions to attack were no longer loyal to the Imperium. The Night Lords, Word Bearers, Iron Warriors and Alpha Legion descended to attack in a brutal combined assault, slaughtering the remnants of the 3 Imperial legions. This event would be known from here on as the Isstvan V Drop Site Massacre. Things looked dark for the Imperium. The strongest legions were still tasked to the fringes of the galaxy, and there seemed little to stand between Horus and his now 7-strong fleet of Astartes legions. Not to mention the further forces of corrupted Imperial Navy, the victorious Dark Mechanicum, who were fighting the Schism of Mars, a civil war between factions on Mars loyal to the Imperium and Horus, and now successfully they had won their campaign there. The traitor legions on Horus would assault and destroy many loyal Imperial bastions as they travelled towards Terra, taking years to do so in the process. By now, the Warmaster had amassed a massive army comprising multiple groups including Titans, Astartes and advanced war gear, corrupted Imperial forces and even cultists from worlds who could spread discord and disrupt Imperial worlds through terrorism or cult activity. The Word Bearers especially revelled in this, often finding that their worlds, previously they converted to the divinity of the Emperor, were more than willing within a fairly short space of time to worship them again as gods or angels, and were a great asset to factor into their battle tactics and use where appropriate these expendable, gullible souls to support their forces. Fortunately for the Imperium, one thing was slowing down Horus and his legions: logistics. Despite acquiring a massive force, Horus found he was unable to move it efficiently around given the limitations of the warp vessels in his fleet, and this did buy the loyalist side some time. There is one other unmentioned force Horus found available to him, that of the warp demons themselves. However, interestingly at this time, despite many Space Marine legions pledging themselves to Horus and to Chaos, they still viewed these creatures as dangerous warp phenomena and opposite to their principles. This shows that at the time it's believable that many of the Space Marines aligned to Horus were perhaps not entirely aware of what it was they were signing up for, and had perceived this more as a political rebellion to impose a new order to the Imperium, rather than the truth of the matter, which was that they were in fact surrendering it to a true fall into a hellish reality and a foul darkness that later awaited them all. This would also be in part down to the previous decisions to instigate a rule of ignorance over such matters, meaning many Astartes warriors genuinely had no real knowledge of what Chaos was or what it represented. Although it has to be said that this was rapidly changing and faster among some legions than others. Matters overall were made worse by the sheer amount of confusion reigning at this time. The warp had been disturbed, making warp travel again difficult. As outlined, this was both a positive and a negative for both sides concerned. It also made communication difficult, meaning some worlds could not be warned, and meant that many did not know the truth of the matter or who indeed they could trust. Rogel Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, had been stationed on Terra for some years now after his return with Nathaniel Garrow, and barely rested in his activities to prepare an insurmountable defence of Terra. However, his task was made all the more difficult by the warp storms which prevented ease of reinforcement as well as communication. In addition, Mars now failed to repel the Dark Mechanicum and had fallen to the Warmaster's forces, and as such had to be continually blockaded and prevented from launching its own attacks to Earth. As far as the Emperor, Malcador and Imperial Fists were concerned, the spearhead on Isstvan V had been a catastrophic failure. Other legions, such as the Ultramarines, were now completely isolated and out of contact, and so they could do nothing but watch the galaxy burn around them, as Horus himself had stated he would as he oversaw the virus bombing of Isstvan III. Despite this period often being documented as clear-cut, death guard against blood angels and so on, it was far more chaotic than this. Although battles and confrontations would occur, it was not as simple as the Warmaster declaring, "X Legion is now under my command." A legion comprised thousands of Space Marines, and they would rarely be all stationed in one location at once. Consequently, this fragmentation meant many could return from stationing elsewhere to find to their horror the truth of the matter. As outlined previously, although Space Marines can often appear to be mechanical machines of war, they are just as complex as any human in their thoughts, decisions and moralities, hence why Horus saw it necessary to slaughter so many loyalists from the legions he would call his own on Isstvan III. This meant that many smaller groups of Marines, when returning to communication with their legion, would either meet a bloody fate at the hands of their brothers should they refuse to convert to the War Master's cause, or instead they would flee to form fragmented groups of rare Marines known as Black Shields. Now, just to diverge very quickly, Black Shields are a rare form of Astartes who have fully severed themselves from their parent legion or chapter, but who still remain loyal to the Imperium. In this early time, however, only some of the Marines would obscure their shoulder plates, others would wear their legion colours and heraldry, proudly believing themselves to be the purest warriors, uncorrupted by the darkness and the last remnants of their previous but now ruined glory. Later in time though, all these rogue Astartes would black out their armour to remain anonymous, as their legion loyalty became a deep shame and irrelevant to their personal missions. Black Shield Space Marines would later become the fabled Death Watch Marines, who dedicate themselves to endlessly battling Xenos using unorthodox methods and allying with fellow Black Shields whose prior legion heritage is irrelevant and often best unspoken of. It is uncommon for the Black Shield to reveal more than bare details other than his name, basic training experiences and so on. They fight in the name of the Imperium but remain in a state of self-imposed exile. The Death Watch Black Shield Marines would also fight in a manner divergent to normal Marines. They will willingly sacrifice themselves where necessary or take on objectives that others would consider a death sentence. In many ways, their lives seem to be a form of penance, carrying the shame and weight of sin thrown down by their legions upon their shoulders, but all the while remaining staunchly loyal to the Emperor. Horus continued his unending campaign of betrayal now, in a bizarre parody of the Imperial Crusade. Each world over which the War Master's shadow fell, a simple choice was given: total submission and surrender, or total destruction and a lifetime of slavery, and ultimately a miserable death. This campaign was also certainly one of fear-mongering and compliance for sibling worlds in a given system. For any world marked for destruction and genocide was never fully extinguished in this manner. It would conveniently allow those survivors who had not simply lost their minds from witnessing the horrors unleashed by the Dark Astartes could convey their experience to other neighbouring worlds, and thereby assuring their near immediate surrender to the War Master's fleet. In this sense, these near-total annihilation attacks on planets by the War Master were not true exterminatus as were seen on Isstvan III, rather they were a clever and brutal propaganda tool to yet again demonstrate Horus's adept ability in the art of war he had perfected through the years of the Imperial Crusades. By now, some 9 of the 20 Space Marine legions were under the command of Horus. An interesting but specifically relevant aside to this is to mention the 2nd and 11th Space Marine legions. They would have all records of their existence destroyed, and no history or explanation given as to their origin, actions or fate. The complete and utter erasure of all records of the 2nd and 11th legions is considered by Imperial historians as the most successful edict of obliteration ever carried out. However, fragments of information do exist through quoted literature or documents, and it seems that these 2 legions' records were eradicated prior to the Horus heresy. We have no way of knowing for sure what happened to the erased 2 legions, but it seems likely they were precursors to the events of the heresy. The Primarch of the Space Wolves, Leman Russ, is recorded as stating that Space Marines had been previously tasked with fighting one another when speaking to Caspar Horsaw, who questioned him. The unprecedented? Like Astartes fighting Astartes? Like the rout being called to sanction another legion? That? No. That is not unprecedented. This gives credence to the possibility that the Space Wolves are the Emperor's preferred execution legion, as they would be later tasked with the destruction of the Thousand Sons and Magnus the Red. Another quote stated, that the wolves will be loosed again. This small fragment suggests it is not the first time they'd faced such a mission. Malcador the Sigillite and Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists would also shed some fragmented light on this history. Malcador would say, "Horus has 3 of his brother legions with him. You have your fists and 13 others. Would that it were 15, mused Dawn. Do not even think it, my friend, warned Malcador. They are lost to us forever. I know, said Dawn. A conversation between Primarch Rogel Dawn and Malcador the Sigillite, and this leads us to speculate that a great darkness caused them to be lost prior to heresy. But the most telling of all would be part of Horus's vision during his out-of-body experience on Davin, where he would have, among other delusions, a reminiscence back in time to the DNA laboratories of the Emperor. We know that the warp creatures had originally scattered the Primarchs, so it seems entirely likely that this vision was at least in part accurate. Horus would describe that. He stopped by the tank with 11 stenciled upon it. The 11th Primarch, feeling the untapped glories that might have lain ahead for what grew within, but knowing that they would never come to pass. This could suggest that Chaos wanted to demonstrate to Horus that he was not the first to be corrupted, and that where previously they had failed and subsequently were destroyed by the Emperor, he would succeed. These glimpses are interesting, but do beg the question, if such a fate had befallen the 2nd and 11th Legions, why was the Emperor not more cautious to allow such darkness to encroach and infect his Astartes again? On the other hand, perhaps it was precisely these earlier corruptions which led the Emperor to his course of outlawing knowledge of chaos, the old adage of what you don't know can't hurt you. Additionally, perhaps the fact that if indeed these 2 now erased legions were corrupted and then crushed by the Space Wolves, could this have lulled the Emperor into a false sense of security, believing any further corruptions to be also surmountable? We could speculate that the Chaos Gods perhaps even allowed these legions to be destroyed prior to the Horus heresy so as to deliberately misdirect the Emperor into believing them to be weaker or less capable a force than they actually were. There is no definitive answer, this is all supposition, but the possibilities and ramifications are particularly intriguing. Whatever the reasons for these prior events and the consequences they would carry, one thing was now certain. Horus's fleet seemed unstoppable as it approached Terra. Rogel Dawn and Malcador the Sigillite were receiving the fragmented survivors from the Isfahan 5 massacre at this time and begun to realise the grim reality of what they were facing. They hurriedly attempted to contact the Space Wolves and White Scars, who, as they were about to return to Terra, were now engaged by the traitors of the Alpha Legion. This made retreat difficult, but the White Scars were able to break free to return to Terra, with the Wolves vowing to follow them on once they had eradicated the Alpha Legion's force. The Ultramarines similarly had been engaged on the planet of Calth against the Wordbearers. Robert Guilliman and the Ultramarines received reinforcements from their vast legion to form one of the greatest forces in the Imperium now left standing, and they would repel the shattered Wordbearers and set course for Terra after receiving their communication from Malcador. However, Guilliman realised all too well they would likely arrive too late to make a significant difference, as had been Horus's original intention on posting them as far from Earth as was possible without it raising suspicion. Now the race was really on, as nearly all the Space Marine legions, loyalist and traitor alike, headed for Holy Terra to determine the final battle for supremacy of the galaxy. Despite all their best efforts, only the White Scars, Blood Angels and Imperial Fists were able to reach Terra before the traitor legions arrived. The loyalists were also supported with 3 Mechanicus Titan legions and millions of Imperial Guard soldiers. Their objective was less to defeat the traitors, that task was not in anybody's mind. Their sole task was simple and twofold. They must protect the Emperor at all costs, and they must survive long enough for reinforcements from the remaining loyalist legions who were still en route to Terra. The Battle of Terra began as expected, with mass orbital bombardments from both the surface to orbit and vice versa. Luna, the Imperial Naval Station, also launched massive attacks with its huge orbital defense system, which sustained the traitors with heavy losses, but sadly not heavy enough to make any significant impact. Horus would destroy first the lunar defences and then the ground defence systems on Earth. It was now open to attack. The first drop pods landed on Terra, carrying the corrupted hellish Chaos Marines who battled the Loyalists for every step of ground they took. In securing the docking port's planetside, the traitors were able to reinforce with thousands more Marines along with the corrupted Dark Mechanicum Titans. Cultists also practiced their invocations, which brought demons large and small out from the warp and into reality, unleashing their horrors on the Loyalists, both Astartes and Imperial Guard alike. The forces of Chaos assaulted the Imperial Palace relentlessly, some being led on by the Primarch, now turned demon Prince Angron of the World Eaters. But each time they attacked, the Blood Angels led by their Primarch Sanguinius would repel them. The White Scars Legion attempted to draw the Dark Forces away from the palace, but each time would be forced into submission, retreating back into the relative shelter of the palaces. Horus, frustrated at this point, and all too aware he was running out of time, ordered one of the Titan legions to demolish entire sections of the Imperial Wall. Despite grievous losses, the Titans, led by the infamous Imperator-class battle titan Disarray, smashed breaches in the Imperial Palace's defences, which the traitors then flooded through. Jakati Khan, Primarch of the White Scars, decided at this time on a change in tactic. Instead of trying to repel the seemingly endless forces of Chaos Marines, he swept a lightning raid to the Lion's Gate spaceport, catching the traitors at the port completely off guard. They were able to secure it quickly and reactivate the orbital defences, which began immediately destroying all descending traitor drop pods and landing transports. In a single action, they had cut the reinforcements of the traitors in half and dealt a substantial blow. They also tried to secure the second main port known as the Eternity Wall, but were unsuccessful as the Chaos Forces had now reinforced their positions. The battle at the main palace was not going well now either, and the Loyalists had been pushed back to the Eternity Gate, the sole point of entry into the inner sanctum of the Imperial Palace. The Marines, the Blood Angels and Imperial Fists were to hold back the attacking Chaos Forces, while the remaining Loyalists made it through the gate to safety. Sanguinius, the Blood Angels Primarch, would now face a terrifying prospect as he flew against a greater demon of Khorne, clashing together head-on as they battled in the air, flying above the mortal forces in a ferocious and blurring battle of godlike ability. Sanguinius would ultimately be victorious, breaking the demonic creature and throwing its shattered body to the howling heretics below. The Warp Gate project the Emperor had secretly been working on resided in this chamber, and it now risked becoming their undoing. Initially, it required only a small portion of the Emperor's psychic attention, but after the damage wrought by Magnus of the Thousand Suns in attempting to reach the Emperor, it subsequently was damaged so badly that it required a significantly higher proportion of the Emperor's powers to keep it closed. Combined with the fact that the forces of Chaos were fighting to use this portal, it became an immense burden to maintain it safely. The Emperor now called on Malcador the Sigillite, informing him that he was required to take his place on the psychic amplifier known as the Golden Throne. This provided the psychic shielding needed to protect the new human-built sections of the webway, which had been the Emperor's secret project and was intended to be the final gift to humanity before the Horus Heresy had begun. The Emperor's original choice of his replacement on the artifact had been Magnus the Red, but now Malcador was the only legitimate successor, being one of the few human remaining psykers with enough strength to carry out the duty. In the final days of the siege, the Emperor ordered Malcador to summon 12 men of character, skill, and determination. These would be tested and trained to become an elite group of investigators intended to root out treachery across the Imperium and in the centuries to come to prevent any event like the Horus Heresy from occurring again. This would become the earliest stirrings of the Inquisition and also later the highly secretive chapter known as the Grey Knights. The Emperor also told Malcador to steel himself as he would need to prepare to make an unbearable sacrifice. Malcador would return from his mission to recruit the foundation of the Inquisition. Using his powerful psychic subterfuge, Malcador and his new recruits were able to pass unscathed through the battle lines and come before the Emperor within the inner gates of the Imperial Palace. Malcador brought before the Emperor his 12 men to be judged for their suitability, and the Emperor saw that Malcador had chosen wisely. Of the 12, 4 were mortal lords and administrators of the Imperium, possessing an inquisitive nature and unyielding strength of mind. The other 8 were space marines, whose abilities were as peerless as their dedication to the Emperor. Some marines were from legions that had abandoned the Emperor in favour of Horus's dark promises, but these battle brothers had never lost their staunch loyalty and had fought the heresy from within in many ways, and they were the truest expression of the Imperium and carried an even stronger will than their Lord Primarchs. Malcador the Sigillite ascended to the Golden Throne, replacing the Emperor who stood before his loyal captains, Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists and Sanguinius of the Blood Angels. Malcador could no longer physically speak, his mind consumed by the concentration he had to bring to bear in order to control the tempest of psychic forces consuming him. The Emperor directed the attention of the 2 Primarchs, the demigods of mankind, to look upon this mere mortal. Malcador, a powerful Psyker, but not an Astartes, not a Primarch, just a man. The Emperor declared to them, "Behold, the greatest sacrifice of our age. Malcador the Sigillite is no more. Henceforth he shall always and only ever be Malcador the hero." Malcador would only be able to withstand the psychic assault on him for a few hours. Powerful as he was but a fraction of the power of the Emperor, and his body, mind and soul would be consumed in a matter of hours. Malcador the Sigillite was a true hero of humanity, saving it from total destruction on numerous occasions, ultimately sacrificing himself for the will of his friend, the Emperor. After 55 days, the Siege of Terror had kept the enemy at the gates, but only just. Both sides knew the defeat of the Imperium was near, and all that was required was the defence or destruction of the Eternity Gate. Horus, knowing this and that he must complete the siege before the arrival of the Loyalist reinforcements from the other Space Marine legions, prepared to teleport to the surface from his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, to lead this final assault in person. The Wordbearer's first chaplain and prime traitor Erebus broke the news to Horus that their demonic allies in the Warp had informed them the Dark Angels and Space Wolf legions were now nearing Terra, and the vast force of Ultramarines were only a short distance away by now. Hearing this news, Horus despaired. All seemed lost. He needed more time to break the most secure enclave of the Imperial Palace, and the massive Imperial reinforcements were only hours away. Horus decided on a dangerous gamble. Dropping the shields of his flagship, he opened the gateway for the Loyalists to board his vessel. The Emperor would not waste this opportunity and teleported aboard the Vengeful Spirit with his elite personal guard, the Legio Custodes. The Primarch Sanguinius and Rogel Dawn, several companies of Imperial Fists and Blood Angels, veteran Marines in the assault. Finding themselves though scattered now throughout the ship, they fought a series of close-quarter battles against hardened Chaos Marines to reach the bridge of the ship and Horus. Sanguinius, the Blood Angel's Primarch, reached his brother Horus first, and the Warmaster attempted to turn his previously oldest and closest friend among the other Primarchs to Chaos one last time. When Sanguinius refused to be corrupted, Horus attacked. Wounded from his many battles on Terra and the battle with the Greater Demon, Sanguinius proved to be easily no match for Horus, who was now at the peak of his demonic power, bearing multiple marks of chaos. Horus strangled to death the angel with cruel ease. An alternate version of this event recorded in the Imperial records has Sanguinius cutting a small hole in Horus's Terminator armour before he died. This chink in the armour would aid in the Emperor's battle against Horus. When the Emperor entered the bridge, he saw the winged corpse of the angelic Sanguinius lying at Horus's feet. Horus engaged the Emperor, calling him foolish for refusing the power that Chaos offered. Horus proclaimed that if the Emperor would kneel before him, he would spare his life. The Emperor knew well the ancient trap that had snared Horus, and the Emperor told the corrupted Primarch that he was the deluded slave of chaos, not its master, for no mortal could ever truly claim to be more than a simple pawn of the ruinous powers. Snarling with frustration, Horus hurled bolts of demonic lightning at the Emperor, who nullified them before they touched him. The Emperor and Horus would engage one another in the throne room of the massive battle barge, a combat of both physical skill and psychic force in nature. The Emperor was unquestionably the most skilled and powerful warrior, but his love for his sons could not bring himself to bear his full strength against Horus, his first son. The Emperor would deflect multiple barrages with his lightning claw, but Horus was possessed, relentless, and sliced open the Emperor's chest armor. He then proceeded to sever the tendons in the right wrist, disarming the Emperor. An enraged psychic blast from the War Master seared the flesh from the Emperor's face, destroying one of his eyes, tearing the broken Emperor's right arm from his socket. Horus raised his father's broken ragdoll body high over his head to throw him down, breaking his body. The vicious and casual brutality of the War Master's act galvanized the now broken Emperor as he awoke to what awaited mankind under the rule of Horus and the Chaos Gods. Realizing at last that his favored son was wholly lost to the corruption of chaos, the Emperor gathered his full psychic power, bringing it through his body and into the Immaterium, unleashing a lance of pure energy that pierced the gloating Horus's psychic defenses. The Emperor, in a white-hot rage, pierced his very being with psychic power. Before Horus died, the Chaos powers would abandon him, and as he looked his father in the eye, shedding a single tear, realizing his unforgivable betrayal, begging his father to forgive him. The Emperor saw regret in his fallen son's eyes, but the Emperor also knew that the Dark Gods could attempt to possess Horus again, and that this time he would not be there to stop them if they did. Forcing all compassion from his mind for the sake of humanity, the Emperor tore his soul apart, not banishing or casting it to some dark realm, but erasing it from reality, destroying Horus utterly. His essence burned from existence in both the physical world and the Immaterium, so that Chaos could not resurrect Horus, their claim on his soul a bitter blow to the Dark Gods, who would scream a terrible psychic scream in their rage and frustration. The destruction of Horus's soul sent a psychic shockwave surging across the solar system, casting the demons of chaos back into the warp, and spreading a mass panic among the traitor legions and other traitor forces on the surface of Terra, who felt in fractions of seconds the weakening power and loss of the chaos mark upon them. It became clear to the traitors their leader had been defeated. In this moment, a terrible berserker fury, later to become known as the Black Rage, encompassed the Blood Angels. From the moment of their Primarch Sanguinius' death, they went out surging forth to scatter the attackers, slashing in all directions, howling vengeance upon them. The already retreating traitor legions ran for their lives, screaming in terror from the frenzied Blood Angels. A screaming retreat soon turned to an apocalyptic bloodbath. Thousands upon thousands of Chaos Space Marines, as well as the Chaos Titans, fell, attempting to flee. Any who fell behind were obliterated by the Blood Angels. Many of them would be later found still wandering around in an insane rage, smashing the broken Chaos Space Marines to pieces with apparently little conscience, thought or control. The ground before the Imperial Palaces was now awash with blood of traitors and heretics. Meanwhile, the Imperial Fist's Primarch Rogel Dawn finally found his way to the corrupted Starship's bridge, only to discover his brother Sanguinius and the shattered and broken body of the Emperor, who was now, despite his near immortal powers, on the very real verge of death. His remaining psychic energy spent in the defense of the Golden Throne and subsequent battle with Horus. The Emperor whispered instructions to Dawn, ordering him to transport him to the device known as the Golden Throne in the inner sanctum of the Imperial Palace. If there was any chance to save the Emperor's life, Dawn would of course do so, without question. Returning to the Golden Throne Room deep in the Imperial Palace, Dawn and the frail body of the Emperor arrived just as Malcador was beginning to fail. His body had been consumed by the immeasurably powerful psychic storms that were now visibly lashing his body. As the tech priests hastily adapted the throne to be able to support the Emperor, Malcador was disconnected. Within minutes of this, though, his husk of a body would turn to dust, blowing across the stone floor. But not before he reached out with the very last of his life energy and transferred it to the Emperor, giving him that last injection of power needed to survive for the moments until he could be transferred to the Golden Throne. This last act of Malcador was another blessing from the Sigillite, as the Imperial attendants would come to the realization that they could do this many times over, and so began the almost endless task of locating and bringing Psykers to Holy Terra, to have the honor of being sacrificed and transferred their energy to the Emperor to keep his spirit alive, and also to keep the door of the raging Imperial webway shut. This last energy from Malcador would allow the Emperor to speak his final commands, to continue the fight to free humanity from the forces of chaos, as well as the ignorance that continued to assail it. With these final words, he would be silent, his body now entombed within the mechanisms of the Golden Throne, his body shattered, but his spirit remaining forever strong. He would command the Imperium through his psychic hints and emanations, interpreted and carried out by the High Lords of Terror. Far from a broken shell, the Emperor would continue to support the Imperium, protecting them by shielding the webway, keeping the beacon of light, the Astronomicon used by Imperial navigators, shining in the darkness, and some say the Emperor still now battles the forces of chaos on their own plane of existence, keeping the worst and most insidious demons from entering the material world or infecting the minds of suggestible men. Humanity had survived the darkest time, but at what cost? Hundreds of worlds stood destroyed or still now infected by the insanity of chaos. Half the Imperial forces had turned traitor and now began to retreat into the dark depths of the galaxy or the Eye of Terror itself. Many previously prosperous worlds were now considered unsavable, and consequently Imperial fleets would arrive to perform exterminatus on these damned worlds, destroying all life on the planet, reducing it to an orbiting rock. The Imperium itself, despite the Emperor's best wishes, would struggle to maintain the sense of bright order once enjoyed during the Crusades. Now it would enter a difficult period, in many ways not too far removed from the 21st century, where states of repression and ignorance were often widespread and caused many of the problems they would face. The Imperium operated on a new level of suppression of its citizens, and in many ways it's hard to really find fault with this rationale. Given the severe blow to their military power, the Lords of Terror and remaining Primarchs needed to hold everything together amidst a crumbling empire. A still angry and battling traitor force who were still present throughout the galaxy and Imperial systems. Worse still was that the Xenos forces such as the Orc, Eldar and later Tyranids would seize on this opportunity to exploit humanity in its weakened state and would descend to ravage Imperial worlds that were unable to be successfully defended during this time. Despite all this, the Imperium of Man would stand strong, and whilst far from the perfect empire the Emperor had sought to create, it would still represent humanity's best hope for survival. They were not cut off and isolated as they had been during the Age of Strife, and in some respects would regain much of their strength in the coming 10,000 years. Now at the end of the Horus Heresy.
Folks, we're at the end of the Horus Heresy. Alright, that's it. We're done. What a journey. Wow. I hope you learned about Horus. I hope you enjoyed learning about the heresy. And, great stuff, man. Great stuff. Gotta love Horus and his heresy. It is over now. Sorry, everybody. We're done. We're done. Actually, hold on. We're not done. We have a Twitch bounty, folks, for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It keeps refreshing. Hold on. All right, good. Okay, the media playback is broken, everyone. Just like oh my Jesus. I blame Twitch television. All right, if anyone's sleeping right now, wake up. Wake up. We're to see the unbelievable Ninja Turtle Twitch bounty here. Can't hear it. Oh, hold on. There you go. Now you hear it. But I want to sleep. Too bad. You gotta wake up.
Go to high school. Maybe get a girlfriend. Can you imagine that?
Can you imagine? Either way, thank you everybody for watching tonight.
I want to know everything about you.
Hopefully you learned a decent amount about Warhammer 40,000. I listened for a while and then I kind of tuned out once they got into human stuff because, you know, humans. Don't worry, Sloth will return and listen to Necrons, Orcs, Tyranids specifically. Maybe tomorrow he'll do the rest of the Horus Heresy and then he can do all the Xeno stuff. I actually don't know much about Tyranids really, so I'd actually be pretty interested to learn about those.
They got to go. Okay, sort of a twist.
Actually, I don't know much about. Well, I kind of know some about Necrons, and I kind of know some about Orcs, but I don't know like anything about Tyranids, so that'd be interesting to learn.
My son, Michelangelo, you have heart. Donatello, you have wisdom.
Dang.
Raphael, you have bravery. And
Bravery.
Leonardo,
Honor. Ninja Turtles.
It's not a problem.
Ninja Turtles. Cowabunga. There it is, folks. Ninja Turtles. Crazy
Not cut
stuff.
off and isolated as they had been during the Age of Strife.
There we go. I'm going to pause it at that moment so I at least remember where I am. Either way, thank you everybody who did subscribe and resubscribe and drop bits and tips. Thank you to Bike Man for the big raid. Thank you very much. If you're from the Bike Man raid still watching, very much appreciated. Also, Donicton, thank you for the 101 months. Oh my god, sub for the sub throne. Thank you, thank you. You know, I am slowly getting better. You know, it's a process. Trust the process. That's all you can do, right? So thank you very much for enjoying the substitute streamer Sloth. Here he is. Great guy. And yeah, there'll probably be some more Sloth streams. Although I am going to play Blood Bowl on Sunday. So maybe a Sloth stream tonight. Saturday, that is. And then Sunday night, I'm going to be playing another Blood Bowl game. Blood Bowl's not too bad because I can like look away and it doesn't take all my brain power to like talk to chat and do stuff. You know what I mean? So thank you very much. I will see you. Well, Sloth will see you tomorrow, and me kind of technically. Okay. Okay. See ya. Oh yeah, follow, hit the bell, etc. See ya.